Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at beginnings and endings, and describe some of the most common patterns for beginnings and endings, and how to choose one that will give your movie the most impact. Let's start at the beginning. So, 3 of the most common beginnings would be to begin in medias res, or in the middle of the action. And this is picking up the story right as something is happening. So, this is in the middle of a chase scene. It begins with your protagonist parachuting out of an airplane on a mission. Anything that sort of just throws the viewer or the reader into the middle of things, and they have to catch up and figure out what's going on as the protagonist does something. You can also give away the ending, and this is used to great effect in many movies I can think of, where at the beginning, the audience or reader is point-blank told how the story will end, and this raises story questions that could be, is that really what happens? Or even just, how do we get from point A to point B? So that can be very effective. There's also simply just coming up with something that is really memorable. A scene or a piece of dialogue or an image that catches people's attention and imagination. Sometimes you see this institutionalized in, for instance, like James Bond. The introduction to all James Bond movies, Bond does something very impressive and daring that is basically unconnected to the rest of the story that is to come, but it's very memorable. Now let's look at endings. So there are lots of different kinds of endings that you can have. You can have an ending where everything is resolved. Everything is tied up in a nice, neat little bow, all of the loose ends have been trimmed and tied up, and the story feels very complete. This is not the kind of ending you would use in the middle of a trilogy, for instance, except perhaps at the end of the 3rd movie in a trilogy. You can also have circular endings, where it comes back to the beginning, wherever the movie began, wherever the protagonist began their journey, they end their journey there. You can also have a reversal, in which the circumstances that the protagonist finds themselves in are very different at the beginning and the ends of the movie. The protagonist probably, if you're not writing a tragedy, has gone from very poor circumstances to very great circumstances. A bittersweet ending is where the protagonist has likely been mostly successful in achieving their goal, but has lost something along the way. The ending of Shakespeare in Love is a really wonderful example of a bittersweet ending, where the characters have accomplished what they set out to do, but it's not exactly happily ever after. You can also have an open-ended ending, and you have to be a little bit careful with those that you don't leave your readers or your viewers feeling too unsatisfied. You have to tie up just enough that they feel like they got a complete story and that the end is not missing, but you can definitely leave things open and lots of questions unanswered, particularly if you're writing a trilogy. Cliffhanger endings also great for movies that are parts of longer series, and this is exactly what it sounds like. You leave people hanging and needing to know what happens next, so that when next summer your big blockbuster hit comes out, they'll be in the opening crowd at midnight waiting to know what happened to the protagonist. Twist endings, again, seen very frequently. It's a very iconic kind of ending if you think about Sixth Sense and how much it gets talked about as being a classic twist. I have a few words of caution about using a twist ending. I really like them a lot. However, you have to make sure that it's not the entire point of your script. I was studying Sixth Sense in depth because I wanted to end a screenplay with a similar twist ending, and it was pointed out to me that I probably ought to take a look at some movies that had done that technique as well before I committed myself or decided the way in which I was going to use the twist. And what I discovered about The Sixth Sense is that the first time you watch it, it's fantastic because you don't know it's coming. The second time you watch it, it is also fantastic because you see all of the things you missed the first time around, and you're just blown away by how could I not have noticed that. However, the third time you watch it, it becomes almost boring because now you've already had both experiences, and if you're not careful, there isn't enough to hold on to as an audience member or a reader. You've already had all of the experiences that you can have of not knowing and then experiencing the surprise of the twist, and then seeing all of the clues. But if there are not more tangible character moments to hold on to, the third viewing can be somewhat lackluster. So if you're going to use a twist ending, I encourage you to spend a lot of time in the middle of your screenplay, making sure that there are a lot of moments that people will want to watch over and over again, character interactions and things like that. And I actually think that The Sixth Sense does a pretty good job of this, because Bruce Willis is so good acting with the little boy that you really enjoy those moments, and so it doesn't tip into quite being lackluster. You can also end with a revelation, which is similar to the twist in that a piece of information is uncovered. And here again, I urge a little bit of caution. You don't want your audience to be left feeling tricked, that if only they had known that, the entire story that they've just seen would not have needed to occur. So I think that this is pretty good when it's a piece of information that is not directly tied to the main plot and the main goal, but is sort of a side goal. I can think of some instances in which perhaps like family relationships get revealed at the end, that it is related and it's important for the journey that we just saw, but the journey would have happened whether or not the revelation had occurred earlier in the film, if that makes sense. You can also end with a monologue. And this I see a lot when it's circular. When a movie begins with a monologue, it's likely that it will also end with a monologue in terms of sort of tying things together. And again, we sort of see the return of a lot of these endings tie back to the beginning. And in fact, I would venture to say that the best endings do relate to the beginning, which, if you remember from the Joseph Campbell lecture on the hero's journey, the whole point of the hero's journey was that it was very cyclical, that it began and ended in a similar spot. So, to look at a few that directly tie beginnings and endings, we have themes and other echoes. So if you begin a movie with a monologue and you end with a monologue, that's going to be a type of echo. If you begin with a certain theme and image that displays a theme, you're probably going to end with a similar image that explores a similar theme and reinforces that. Before and after also is a very common pairing, where you'll see the character in their circumstances at the beginning of the movie, and then you'll see almost identical shot or scene at the end in the same location, but at this point the protagonist has changed their circumstances. They are a different person. So this would be the type of thing where you began with a montage of your protagonist getting ready in the morning before they were going to their office job and hated it. And you would end with a very similar montage of them getting ready and going to perhaps a different job, if that was the point of the story, and this time they really enjoy it. Or going to the same job but having a different view of it. Those are the kinds of before and afters that we're talking about here. So I've mentioned a few, but let's take a look at some other examples from great screenplays for beginnings and endings. So, the beginning of Tangled gives away the ending. Flynn Rider says, "This is the story of how I died." That is the very first thing that he says, and indeed it is a story about how he dies. Now, of course, there's also a twist at the end of this, but he's basically given you what happens. But you don't know whether you're supposed to take him seriously or not the first time you see the film. So at the end, when it looks like he has died, it is very, very emotionally wrenching as an audience member. American Beauty has a very similar beginning. He says, "In less than a year, I'll be dead." Again, that raises all kinds of story questions, and it also sets a clock in that case. In terms of endings, a very memorable ending in terms of a line of dialogue that just sticks out and has become canonized is the end of When Harry Met Sally. "You had me at hello." The Usual Suspects, I will not spoil this, but it has an excellent twist ending. The Sixth Sense, we've also discussed, has a twist ending. Juno has before and after going for it. When Juno begins, she's walking through her town drinking the thing of Sunny D, and we don't really know why yet. But you see her moving through her world. And at the end of the movie, after all of the struggle and epiphany and climax has happened, the resolution, she bikes through her world at a slightly different time of year, in slightly different circumstances, and encounters slightly different people. And we sort of are highlighted all of the ways in which she has changed as a person over the last 9 months from the beginning of the movie until the resolution. Loving Annabelle also has very circular beginnings and ending. This is an interesting sort of short movie. It's just over an hour long, but the same shot essentially opens and closes the movie. That in the opening, one girl arrives, but the shot is through, it's framed on a car window, a back car window that's shiny, and it's reflecting trees as they're driving, and the window's half down and the girl is sitting in the back seat. And at the end of the movie, it's basically exactly the same shot, similar frame, window half rolled down, reflecting the trees, as another woman is leaving the place that they have come from. And so you see sort of this mirroring at the beginning and the end, and again, it also shows changed circumstances. The Breakfast Club has one of my favorite examples of a circular beginning and ending, because it begins with a monologue and it ends with a monologue, which is really finishing up the monologue from the beginning. And so I'd just like to read you the opening monologue and the closing monologue to illustrate how thematically this ties to what gets set up in The Breakfast Club. If you have not seen The Breakfast Club, I highly recommend it. It's excellently structured. It's an example of having multiple complete stories told in one movie. And also it's a great example of telling a complete story within a single day. So here's the opening monologue of The Breakfast Club. Saturday, March 24th, 1984, Shermer High School, Shermer, Illinois, 60062. Dear Mr. Vernon, we accept the fact that we had to sacrifice a whole Saturday in detention for whatever it was we did wrong. What we did was wrong. But we think you're crazy to make us write an essay telling you who we think we are. What do you care? You see us as you want to see us. In the simplest terms, in the most convenient definitions. You see us as a brain, an athlete, a basket case, a princess, and a criminal. Correct? That's the way we saw each other at 7 o'clock this morning. Now right there we have established basically the thematic setup of this story. These individuals have been pigeonholed as athlete, basket case, princess, criminal, and brain. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, when they arrive at school, that's how they see each other as well. However, that line, that's the way we saw each other at 7 o'clock this morning, indicates that when they leave, things have changed. And indeed, they have. Here is the ending monologue, which finishes up the note from the beginning. Dear Mr. Vernon, we accept the fact that we had to sacrifice a whole Saturday in detention for whatever it was we did wrong. But we think you're crazy for making us write an essay telling you who we think we are. You see us as you want to see us, in the simplest terms, in the most convenient definitions. But what we found out is that each one of us is a brain, and an athlete, and a basket case, and a princess, and a criminal. Does that answer your question? Sincerely yours, The Breakfast Club. Now, that brings full circle what we set up in the beginning of that movie. And that directly mirrors the emotional journey that all of the characters took that day in terms of figuring out who everybody else in that room was and who they were themselves, and that perhaps they had been seeing themselves in simple terms as well. So that's a great example. I really recommend checking out that movie if you have not seen it. And for this week's test drive, think about which beginning and ending technique will work best for your screenplay. Jot down some ideas about how you might use the different possibilities discussed in this lesson, and as you look at your story structure that you're beginning to form with your 9 checkpoints, think about how you might tie the beginning circumstances to the ending circumstances, how you might show visually, or tell visually if you're using a monologue, how those circumstances have altered, ways to cleverly show the protagonist changed in some way. So take a look at that, think about that, and I will see you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. Well, now that we've talked about beginnings and endings, let's talk about all the steps that you need to get from that beginning to the end. And these are going to be your scenes. So let's begin by addressing the question of what is a scene. A scene is a self-contained unit. It is located in one time at one place, and it can be anywhere from a few seconds to 5 or 6 minutes in length. Most scenes are probably in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 minutes, and you should think of these as your building blocks. So, let's ask the question, what do scenes do? A good scene does some of these things. A great scene does all of them. So, they advance the story, reveal character, explore a theme, and build an image. Now, let's take a deeper look at all of these, and then I'll show you an example of a scene that does a lot of them very well. So, advancing the story. This one is probably the simplest component. It's fairly straightforward. Something happens that moves the story forward. Your character does something, learns something, or decides to try something. Something happens that propels us from point A to point B. So in a linear story, something in scene 2 happens that was the result of something that happened in scene 1, and then that thing that happens in scene 2 causes something else to happen in scene 3 and propels us through the story. In a nonlinear story, you're still going to need to be propelling the audience from the beginning to the middle to the end, but the relationship between the scenes may not be quite as straightforward as something happens which causes something else, which causes something else. You may be giving us more pieces of information, clues in a murder mystery, filling in the gaps. You may be asking and answering story questions to keep us interested in guessing about what's coming up. The next thing that a scene can do is reveal character. It's really important for us to get to know your characters, what makes them tick and what motivates them, because these are the kinds of details that will make us sympathize with your protagonist, detest your antagonist, and understand the actions of the supporting characters. Some of the best ways to reveal character are by seeing them do things. We don't learn very much simply by hearing about a character. Hearing that somebody is very kind or very intelligent or brave doesn't really tell us much about them actually, because how much do we believe the person speaking? But we do learn by seeing them do stuff, particularly how they make decisions, what kinds of actions they take, and how they react to pressure. That is the number one way to reveal character, is to put them under more and more pressure and see what they do as their reaction to that and the decisions they make as a result of it. You can also explore theme or themes in a scene. Movies can be about a lot of things, from relatively simple concepts all the way up to complex ideas about the human condition, love, hate, things like that. And your scene should reflect your movie's theme so that your message is driven home again and again throughout your screenplay. And some of the best ways to reveal theme are again through a character's decisions and actions, but also through images, which leads us nicely into the next thing that scenes can do, which are building images. Movies aren't called moving pictures for nothing. And remember that the goal of writing a screenplay is to paint that visual picture. Think of a movie that you saw that took your breath away because you thought that the shots in it were beautiful or powerful or compelling in some way. Now, if you've ever had the chance to visit a film set, you'll realize that the amount of technical effort that goes into making a single shot lit beautifully, set up beautifully, framed beautifully is staggering. And if you were to pan simply a few degrees to the left or right of that scene and that shot, you would find a tangle of wires and lighting equipment, and hours, literally hours of work can go into lighting a single shot for a film. Now, that level of attention to detail and effort that they apply on set, you should be applying in your writing. An image can also say a lot about your movie. So I'm going to show you some very iconic images from some great films that I enjoy a lot, and talk a little bit about why that image is so powerful or compelling or memorable for a particular movie. So I'm going to begin with a shot from The Breakfast Club. And now if you're familiar with this movie, you will recall that there are 5 teenagers who are sentenced to Saturday detention and are basically locked into their school library. Now, the point is that all of these teenagers are drastically different, and they each come from a different stereotype. But here we see them sitting on the floor together in this library. And the point is that they are finding common ground. And that's what they learn throughout the movie, is that each one of them has a little piece of all of the other stereotypes in them, and that nobody is as simple as they think. So now I invite you to look at this image and consider how different it would be if they were not all on the same level, for instance. What if Molly Ringwald, the princess, was sitting on a stool above everybody else? How would that change what this image says? What if they were all sitting on stools? How does that change it? This is the kind of thing that you can definitely write into your screenplay. You could describe this scene, 5 teenagers sitting in a semicircle on the floor of their library, but think about what volumes that says and underscores the message that the screenwriter was trying to drive home. Another really iconic image is from E.T. And what does this image say to you? It says friendship and magic and space and daring, and it captures a lot of the feeling behind that movie and the triumph of this moment in it. Another one that I particularly like is this image from The Notebook. And this has become one of the most classic images. Even if you haven't seen The Notebook, I'm sure that you recognize this. And if you have not seen The Notebook, this image still says a fair amount about what's going on. Blind, you could look at this image and it's clearly two lovers. It looks like they're reuniting. They're in the rain, which brings up ideas about rebirth and redemption. So this is a very powerful image, something that can be captured on the page as well. And then finally, I will end with what is perhaps one of the most iconic images in cinema history, and that is this image from Titanic. Now, this occurs early in the movie, and not to get cheesy here, but to me, this image says that Jack, this free-spirited person who loves Rose, and that love is literally giving her wings in this scene, which plays into the larger story that the movie is telling, because as you'll recall, this movie ends with a shot that pans across photographs of all of the things that Rose has done with her life that she and Jack talked about, riding a horse, learning to fly an airplane, and all of that. And none of that would have happened if this scene had not happened in this movie. And this image manages to capture that feeling. So this is the kind of thing that you want to be writing into your scenes as you're thinking about those images that are going to be memorable, iconic, and also meaningful. So let's put all those pieces together and talk about a scene from Spider-Man. And I'm talking about the 2002 version. And this is the scene where Peter Parker gets bitten. Now, basically what happens in this scene is that the kids file into the laboratory and are being given a tour. And this poor scientist is leading them around being largely ignored as she tells them about the spiders that they are studying. But what really is going on is that Peter Parker is talking to Harry Osborn, and they're talking about Mary Jane, and you're seeing a little slice of life here. And so clearly the story is being advanced in this scene because it ends with him getting bitten, and frankly, if that didn't happen, neither would the rest of the movie. Now, the scene also does a good job of revealing character. We see that Peter Parker is very smart. He has numerous facts at his disposal. He's clearly a little bit of a nerd. We also see that he's shy and that he's in love with Mary Jane. Now, we learn a little bit about Mary Jane and Harry in this scene too. Mary Jane is not happy with her boyfriend, but she is kind because she agrees to pose for Peter's picture when he asks if he can take one for the school paper. We learn that Harry is also brave to a certain extent because he stands up for Peter. And this explores the theme. The theme of this movie is, with great power comes great responsibility. And while there are certainly scenes in this movie that explore that to an even greater extent and more explicitly, this one begins to sort of put a little bit of that in there, because you have the popular kids who are picking on Peter and are clearly abusing that power and not using it well. And at this point, Peter is pretty powerless, so we're getting a little bit of that imagery as well. In terms of building images, there is a really interesting shot of a spider web being built in the corner of the lab that has one of the missing spiders in it. Now, knowing that this is there, it creates a lot of tension when Peter Parker begins to back up underneath the web, as we're thinking, you know, rightly, that he's about to get bitten by this thing. But it's a very sort of image that stands out of the scene that has the kids in the background out of focus. Which again, you can't exactly describe in so many words in your screenplay, but you can describe the details of the spider's web and the implications that it may have. Now, what this scene also does is it does a good job of conveying some exposition as well. And exposition is boring, usually, but sometimes you just have to get it out there. And so the figure in this scene who is conveying the exposition is the scientist leading the tour. Now, she's being largely ignored, and thus it's not like she's standing there giving a 5-minute long monologue about the spider's properties. But she does manage to work in the 3 key points that are going to be important, namely jumping, web strength, and the spider sense. So that's all in there. And that sort of leads me into my next topic, which is dealing with exposition, because sometimes you just have to do it. So, it's boring, but when it has to be in there, here are some techniques for dealing with it. You can put it under the title sequence. Sometimes your movie may not have a title sequence, when obviously that won't work, but if there is sort of a chance for you to convey some backstory or some important historical facts, that can be a good place to do it. A good bet is to put it in dialogue between characters, because in the real world, people don't monologue. You can also scatter it throughout your screenplay instead of revealing it all at once. That can be very effective because it keeps people interested in guessing as well. You can also have it delivered by an interesting character. Now, Linda Seeger has a very good example in her book, Making a Good Script Great. She calls out Titanic, and there's the very memorable guy who is on the ship, beard, bushy beard, smiley face t-shirt, and he gives an in-depth analysis of how the ship sank. And this is important because the audience needs to know this so that we will be on the edge of our seat later on in the movie when the ship actually starts sinking. But that information could be kind of boring given as a history lecture. And so instead he's sitting there treating it very irreverently and adding sound effects and things like that. So boring information being delivered by an interesting character is a great example. You can also add conflict to a scene in which you're delivering exposition. In Pirates of the Caribbean, Elizabeth Swann explains what the code of parley is as she's being held at gunpoint. So we have some motivation to listen to her and find out what this parley code is and how it might save her. So those are all great techniques for dealing with exposition, because as much as possible you want to avoid the person just standing there telling you, ah yes, the nuclear reactor is set to overload unless you scan your fingerprint. That's boring. So it's best to use one of these techniques to sort of draw it out and make your exposition as integrated as possible. Another thing to avoid in your scenes are talking head scenes. And these are scenes where 2 characters just sit and have a conversation. That gets very boring very quickly. And it's best if you give your characters something to do. They can have exactly the same conversation, but perhaps instead of just sitting someplace, they are instead cooking dinner or working in the garden, playing tennis. Now, talking head scenes are something to avoid in general. However, occasionally they are used to very great effect. And one that I will call out in particular is Sideways. And there is a beautiful scene where Miles and Maya are sitting on her porch, and he's talking about the Pinot Noir that they're drinking. And it's a fairly long scene. It's about 2 or 3 minutes, and it's just them sitting on the porch. But what you realize as he talks is that he's not just talking about the Pinot Noir, he's actually talking about himself. And so great actors in a great situation with some great writing combine to make a really compelling and memorable scene. But you want to use this sparingly as you write. In Miscongeniality, there's a great example of giving characters something to do while they have an exposition-laden conversation. And so he is trying to convince her to enter the beauty pageant, and she is trying to reject the assignment. And so what they're doing, instead of sitting in an office, is that they are in the gym and they're wrestling. And so there's this added tension because it's implied that whoever wins the wrestling match is going to win the argument. And so it adds a lot of interesting conflict to that otherwise potentially talking heads boring scene. Finally, the last thing that I will mention in terms of a type of technique or a type of scene that you can use is a montage, which actually isn't so much a complete scene, it's rather sections of a lot of scenes that are not fully developed. And you can use montages to great effect, but you do want to be careful that you're not overusing them in a screenplay. But they're great because they can condense information down into a bite-sized chunk. They can also be used to skip long periods of time. For instance, if the focus of your screenplay is not a relationship's development, but it is important for it to be in there, you can skip over several months of somebody getting to know somebody else by using a montage. Times not to use a montage is if you're using it to skip conflict. If you're using it to skip conflict, you need to suck it up and write the conflict, because that's what people are going to movies to see, even if it's not what they would like in their real life. So you can think of the classic falling in love montage. There's a great use of montage at the beginning of Up, which tells an entire love story and lifetime in 5 minutes. There's the training montage in Rocky. There's the history of superheroes montage in Watchmen. These are all great uses of montage to either skip time, summarize events, or convey information quickly. So, tips for writing great scenes. Use short scenes to orient your audience, i.e. establishing a location. So if your character is moving to a different location, showing them driving up in their car and getting out in front of somebody else's apartment could be a really good way to clue in that the next scene is about to take place in the apartment. Basically just use your common sense here. If it ever gets confusing where your characters are or where they're going, consider using a very short, and I'm talking, this could be 2 lines in a screenplay, just to sort of let us know where we are. You also want to keep your scenes tight and to the point, starting at the last possible moment and ending as soon as you can. And my final tip is that longer scenes should have beginnings, middles, and ends. Think of it as mini structure, and that will keep you focused as well on keeping it tight and together. And it will also give you a clue about where it should end, because when you've accomplished the goal, you've reached the ending. I find that I often have to throw out the first page and a half of a scene that I've written because I take too long getting into them. So again, as well, identifying that clear beginning, middle, and end can really help you out when you're writing your scenes. So that is a quick look at the building blocks that you will use to construct your screenplay. And it is a little bit difficult to give an estimate for how many scenes a movie has because a lot of it depends on the pacing. But I would say that a very, very rough estimate is that the average length of a scene is probably 2 minutes. So dividing that into a 2-hour movie gives you a pretty good idea about what neighborhood you should be starting with. So I hope that you have found that interesting, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about treatments and outlines, which are the final steps before you begin actually writing your screenplay. Congratulations on having finished your 9 story structure checkpoints. Armed with these, you're ready to approach your treatment and your outline. Let's begin with a treatment. Now, a treatment is between 2 and 5 pages long, and it tells your idea from start to finish. And the idea is that it should read like a short story. There is a little bit of disagreement about the length of a treatment. Some people think that it should be very short, 2 to 5 pages, and I tend to agree. Because if you write much longer, some people say that it could be really as long as you want, but by the time you've written a 60-page treatment, why weren't you writing a novel? If it reads well that way, then wonderful. Perhaps you should consider extending it into a novel. However, if you're convinced that you have a screenplay, this is really just to help you focus your idea and think of it as a complete whole instead of getting super focused on the first act and neglecting Act 2 and Act 3. This helps you avoid the 30-page orphan problem, because by writing from start to finish, you basically know where you were going, and so you are able to power through Act 2 and the struggle because you know where the resolution is, because you've already written a little bit of it, although it's not as fleshed out as it will be later on. So, in reading like a short story, that means it should be written in the present tense, and you can actually use key scenes and dialogue that will be straight out of your screenplay. And this is a marketing document, which means that other people will see it. It's very likely that if you submit to agents or producers, they're going to want to see a treatment before they ask to see your screenplay, so you should really take some time to polish this, but probably after you finish the screenplay. At this point, it can be kind of a rough map for you to follow. Now, your outline is your more detailed map. And here you're going to begin with your 9 checkpoints. So I suggest opening up a Word document and using the outline feature and beginning with Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and filling in those 9 checkpoints and typing in exactly what you've got written for each of those at this moment. And then you begin filling in the gaps with the scenes that we talked about in the previous lesson. And as you do this, you want to be conscious of about how much time things will take. Now, this is a little bit challenging, and practice makes perfect here, but a very rough estimate is 2 minutes per scene, but there is a lot of variability there, as we discussed. Scenes could be anywhere from 10 or 15 seconds to 5 minutes, but you want to make sure that you don't have vastly more material than you can handle. And as you go, if you discover that the way that you have plotted out Act 1, say, the number of scenes that you included in Act 1, and you've written an Act 1 that's an hour long, you know that you're going to have to start trimming that, because Act 1 really should come in about half an hour or less. And so before you jump into Act 2, at that point, if you realize that your scenes are taking longer than you expect, that's a time to go in and start pruning before you begin writing, because it is much easier to trim in the outline phase than it is once you actually have words committed into the script form. At least I find that to be true. On the other hand, if you end up being very short, then you know that you have time to add more details and layer in more things, and you can add as you go. So for each scene, you should pretty much include who's there, where it takes place, and what happens. And now, this outline is not a document that you will ever show to anyone else. So the best bet here is to do what works for you. And there are a couple of approaches that I have encountered over the years. There's the approach that says you should take a sentence or two per scene, and then there's the approach that says you should add as many details as you can think of as you go. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of those. So style number 1, a couple of sentences per scene. This is an outline for a script that I was working on called Once Upon a Time. And here you can see that the way that I've chosen to lay it out is I've given you the beginning, so it's Act 1, and I've pretty much done it as it would appear in the screenplay, as we will talk in the next section of lessons about formatting. But we have interior upstairs bedroom day. And then I have introduced some characters and told what happens. So Anna reads to her daughter Jenna from the Book of Enningham. Jenna's father, Dr. Roberts, comes in and stops Anna from finishing her story. He tells Jenna to go play in her room while he gives Anna her pills. Anna gives Jenna the book. That's a really brief summary of what I imagine that scene to be like. Now, I probably know a lot more details about that than you do because I know where I wanted to take this and what I sort of saw in my head, but that's enough that I can remind myself of what I was thinking when I thought that would be a good way to open the story. An example of one where I certainly know something that an external person does not is scene 5, external wishing well continuous, Jenna makes a wish. Well, I know what Jenna wished for, but you don't. So this is why this is a document that is just for me. So anything that I am finding useful to remind myself as I start to write what I want to have happen. Now, this ended up being about 3 pages for a 2-hour screenplay. Style number 2 is writing down as many details as you can think of. And because of the software I was using, this one looks a little bit messier, but it's actually just a formatting issue more than anything else. But here, in the same amount of space, where I had 6 scenes in the previous example, I now only have 2 scenes, and actually these were kind of short for this outline. I wanted to give you one where you could actually see a couple of complete ones, and here it's much more freeform, where I don't have it quite as formalized in terms of where it's taking place. I've given the names something that's a little bit more representational in terms of like what happens. You know, conversation with Pascal. Zia does paperwork on her handheld and Pascal comes in to tell her he's reassigning her. And then you can see as you read through this that I've almost given myself bullet points for beats of the scene, what happens. And then sometimes I've included dialogue. I knew his father, but this boy, watch him, get to know him, find out what direction he's taking things. That's a line of dialogue that popped into my head at some point, and I thought, that's great, I want to use that, so I jotted it down in here. I also have some notes for myself, like Pascal's motive, what he wants here. So these are all much more fleshed out than the previous one, and this ended up being about a 20-page outline for a 2-hour movie. This was the first completed screenplay that I wrote, and so I found this level of detail to be very helpful because I sort of got into a creative zone where I was working on this, where I got an idea that really made the rest of it snap into focus, and while I was sort of in that place, I wanted to get all of my ideas down on paper so that I wouldn't forget them, but I didn't know how long it was going to take me to write the screenplay, and so I chose to have a very extensive outline. What I tend to do now falls somewhere between these two extremes, where if I've got a scene that's very pivotal and very important and occurs later in the screenplay because I prefer to work chronologically, I will make much more extensive notes about a scene that's near the epiphany, say, if I know that that's very important for something that I'm working towards in terms of actually getting some real dialogue in there and some events. If I've got symbols that I'm weaving throughout, I'll make much more extensive notes towards the end than I will at the beginning, because at the beginning I find that I'm gonna be writing those pages sooner, so I have a better chance of remembering what it is that I wanted. So I have to say that outlining is the most important step of this entire process. The story structuring elements of the 9 checkpoints are the foundation of the outline, and you could probably, with a little bit of luck, go off of just those. But beyond that, the outline is your tool. It's your roadmap. It's the detailed step-by-step instructions of how to get from page 1 to page 120. And it can feel very frustrating at a time where you just want to start writing, but I promise that if you invest the time in making a really good, solid outline, you will save yourself so much hassle and rewrites. Because in the outline form, if you realize that something isn't working and you have to change the plotting of an entire act, it hurts a little bit, but you can throw out all of Act 2 and start over, and it's not the investment that it would be if you had written 60 pages of screenplay and realized you could use none of it. Now, that almost never happens because the story structure checkpoints keep you on track at an earlier stage. But it is much easier, I have found, to sacrifice material and scenes that you are attached to when they're only in their outline form than after they're written in long form. Because nothing hurts worse than writing a scene that you think is absolutely wonderful and discovering that it doesn't have anything to do with the story that you're telling. So, I really recommend taking the time to outline. And this week's test drive, there are 2 things. Practice outlining a movie you're familiar with, preferably one that is similar in tone and style to the script you want to write. This will help you on a number of levels. You can see how many scenes there are roughly in the length movie that you chose to watch. If it's a movie that feels a little bit slower, it's a little bit slower pace, something like perhaps Sideways, probably it's going to have fewer scenes than a movie that is very frenetically paced and intense, which could have many scenes that were much shorter. And so that, if you're trying to do something that's similar to it, you'll sort of know what you're shooting for in terms of scene count. In terms of tone and style, it will also help you just focus in on elements that are working in that genre that you like and don't like, that will help you as you approach your own outline. So when I was working on the screenplay A Quintessence of Dust, which was the second outline example I gave you, that was the one that had a twist ending. And so I actually ended up watching, I watched 2 movies. I watched Blade Runner, which had many similarities to it, but in terms of the twist ending, I also did an outline for The Sixth Sense, which I have provided in the supplemental material for this week so that you can take a look at the notes that I jotted down while I was watching The Sixth Sense for the 3rd time. And then finally, at long last, begin outlining your own screenplay idea. Start with the 9 checkpoints, and then start filling in the gaps with those scenes that get you from page 1 to page 120. And I will look forward to seeing you in the next section where we start talking about actually writing your screenplay. See you then. Hello, and welcome back. Congratulations on finishing your outline. You're now almost ready to start writing your screenplay. However, before we can start typing away, we need to take a quick look at the tools out there to help you write your screenplay. Now, you might be tempted to just try and use Word, but I can assure you that once you've seen the lesson on formatting and the specifics behind it, all of those margins and all of those different tabs are going to be a nightmare to handle. So it is much more advantageous for you to have a piece of software which will format it for you. So let's take a look at the screenwriting software out there that can help you with this process. So, the industry standard is Final Draft, which I'm sure that most of you has probably heard of and perhaps have even used. A quick rundown on the Final Draft stats are that it's $250, it works for Macs or PCs, and it automatically formats your screenplay for you. The other great thing about Final Draft is that it has many integrated planning and outlining features like virtual index cards, which can help you stay organized as you write. It also allows you to add script notes, much in the way that you add comments to a Word document. It'll let you sort of type in a note about a particular part of the screenplay without actually having to type in the screenplay. which can really help keep you organized, particularly if you're corresponding with somebody who's giving you feedback. And the other wonderful thing is that everyone in the industry has Final Draft, so you can exchange files very easily. However, that $250 price tag is pretty hefty. So if this is something where you're not willing to commit that kind of resources to something where you're still sort of figuring out whether or not this is something that you're passionate about, what I suggest is this great free alternative, which is Celtics. And this is what I used in college. Celtics is free. There is a $15 version, Celtics Plus, that comes with a note card feature, but I found that the free version worked great for me, and I honestly never used the note card feature, so I didn't miss it. It works for Macs or PCs. It also automatically formats your screenplay, and it allows you to export your screenplay as a PDF. So while it is somewhat limiting that other people cannot edit that PDF, it's not like you're locked into the Celtics format alone. You can get it out there, get it out of the program in other formats that you can send to people who don't necessarily have Celtics. However, the feature that Celtics is missing that I do miss a lot is that ability to add notes without typing directly into the screenplay. Because if I have sent the document to somebody and I'm hoping that they will make edits and comments, it's always a challenge to figure out where their comment was supposed to go. If they send me, for instance, a Word document that is not directly tied to the spot in the screenplay where they made that comment, I end up having a lot of phone calls where I'm like, what did you mean exactly? Where was this an issue for you, is I guess my point there. However, it is a wonderful alternative to Final Draft if it's something where it's just not feasible for you to spend that kind of money right now, or if you just sort of want to see how it goes. So I do really recommend that. And in fact, this week's test drive, what I encourage you to do is go to finaldraft.com and celtics.com and explore the features and testimonials and decide which piece of software is the best choice for you. Since most of you probably will end up electing to go with Celtics, at least at the beginning, there's a lesson coming up in which I will show you how to use Celtics, so you may want to download the free trial anyway so that you can follow along with that lesson. So, I will see you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of formatting your screenplay. While this is something that screenwriting software will, for the most part, take care of for you, it's good to have a general idea of what industry standard is. Now, I am going to call out a book called The Hollywood Standard that is a wonderful resource if you ever want more information or very specific information about how to format a screenplay. This is a really great guide to things from very basic things as simple as what the margin should be for a screenplay, to very specifics, formatting a dream sequence flashback set 50 years ago that's underwater. This can tell you how to format that. So I do highly recommend checking this out if you are interested. But for now, this lesson is going to talk about the basics of formatting your screenplay. What should go where, and how it should be formatted. And then in the next lesson, I will talk about some of the most common situations that come up that are a little bit more challenging, and I will get into specifically how to format those cases. But for now, let's begin at the beginning, with your title page. Now, if you're writing a spec script, which means that you don't have a contract or an assignment from a studio, and this is probably most of you, your title page needs to have 3 pieces of information on it. The first is your title. Your title will appear 4 inches from the top of the page. It will be centered, in all caps, and underscored. The next thing that needs to be on your title page is your name. If you are writing team, your names will be joined by an ampersand. So there's an example right there of John Doe and Sarah Smith working together and how it would appear. And this will appear underneath your title, 2 lines. The third thing is your contact information, and this will appear in the bottom right corner, and it should include your phone, email, and mailing address. There's a little bit of disagreement out there about whether they want your email address, but frankly I think we live in the digital age, and if somebody wants to get in touch with you, the easiest thing to do is email, so I always put mine on there. And then here is an example of such a title page. You can see My Amazing Screenplay Title, written by Danny Alcorn, and there is, in the bottom right-hand corner, contact information should anybody wish to read My Amazing Screenplay Title. All right, now, the basics of writing a screenplay. If you're sending it a hard copy to somebody in the business, you're going to want to print it single-sided. However, I do highly recommend printing it double-sided for your own personal use or to give to your friends and family for feedback, as it saves a lot of paper. You want to use Courier or Courier New font in 12 point. Courier and Courier New are fixed pitch fonts, which means that each letter, no matter what it is, whether it's a lowercase l or an uppercase W, takes up the same amount of space horizontally on the line. Now, why is that so important? Well, it means that every page has approximately the same amount of material on it, which means that the 1 minute per page rule holds true. And that's important because it allows screenwriters, directors, and producers to gauge the length of a screenplay. Now, there are 4 main elements that you will find in a screenplay, and they are scene headings, also called slug lines, action lines, which also get called description, and if you're in the Midwest, it seems to be wall-to-wall, but that's just the stuff that describes the action that's going on in your scene. And then you have dialogue and transitions. So we'll take a basic look at each of these now, but then in the next lesson, as I said, I'll get into some more specific instances about how to format these things. So let's begin with scene headings. So the basics are that these are the lines that introduce a new scene. They are written in all caps, and the margins are 1.7 inches from the left and 1.1 inches from the right. The 3 elements of a scene heading. The first is whether the scene is indoors or outdoors, and this is abbreviated int or ext with a period in all caps at the front of the line. The next element is the location, and this will be a physical location where the scene is actually taking place. The final element is the time of day, and this is when the scene takes place. And you can go very simple here, simply saying day or night. You can go a little bit more poetic, using sunrise, sunset, dead of night. And you can also go helpful, where you simply say something like later, 15 minutes later, or continuous. And continuous is what you would use if the scene that you are writing has changed location, but there's actually no break in time. So an example of this might be 2 characters having a conversation in a car would be labeled as interior Jane's car day. But when they actually get where they're going, perhaps they get out of the car and it's suddenly exterior park continuous. There has been no break there, but they are in a different location. And then here are some examples. So you can have interior screenwriting classroom day, exterior playground night, interior John's car sunset, exterior McDonald's parking lot later. The only time that there is ever a non-capitalized letter in a slug line is for something like McDonald's, where it just looks very strange to have that C capitalized. So something like that you can go ahead and not, but other than that, everything should always be capitalized. Now, a great question is, when do you need a new scene heading? And the answer is pretty much whenever there is a change of location or time. You also may run into situations where it simply makes logical sense to have one, and your rule of thumb should always be for clarity's sake. If it is unclear that something has changed and it will become clear by adding a new scene heading, do so. Things not to put in a scene heading are action and articles. And by action, I mean you would never want to say, interior Bobby opens his eyes. You would say interior Bobby's bedroom, and then your first line of action would be Bobby opens his eyes. You can also usually leave out articles like a and the, simply for space reasons. Okay, moving on, we have action lines. So these are the lines that describe the setting and the character's actions. And they're written like normal paragraphs, so they're probably the thing that you're most familiar with, actually, if you're just getting into screenwriting, because they're pretty much just like writing a short story or a novel. Margins here are again 1.7 inches from the left and 1.1 from the right. Some details about action lines is that they are written in present tense, and they're punctuated correctly, as you would any sort of normal writing. All caps are used in 2 specific cases. One is the first time a character is being introduced, their name will appear in all caps, and that only happens the very first time that they're on screen. Every time they come into a scene after that, it's just normal with their name in lowercase. The other time that you will use all caps is when a sound is heard. So for example, door hinges creak. Creak will be in all capitals. Try to avoid large blocks of text when you're writing your action lines. People sort of hate the large black bits on a page. You want to keep them to 4 lines or less wherever possible. And if you're pressed for space, figuring out where to trim even a few words here and there to get something that has maybe 1 line and 2 words onto 1 line can really help you save space. All right, our next element is dialogue. And dialogue consists of 3 things. The character name, which appears in all caps every time, and that's justified 4.1 inches from the left. The words that are actually spoken. The left margin for that is 2.7 inches and the right margin is 2.4 inches. And you should note that the character name is not actually centered over the dialogue. The character name always begins 4.1 inches from the left, even when this means that it is not centered, given the length of the character's name. Finally, the third element of dialogue are parentheticals. And these are short descriptions of either how a line is delivered or an action that occurs simultaneously with the speech. The margins here are going to be 3.4 from the left and 3.1 from the right. And here's a piece of example dialogue as it would occur. And you can see that we sort of put them all pieces together here, that we have our scene heading, an action line, and then some dialogue. So here we have interior living room night. Roger and Amy Thatcher sit on a ratty green sofa looking at their son John, who stands behind the coffee table. John. Mom, Dad, I'm joining the army. Beat. This is when you're supposed to say something. Now, the most common parenthetical is probably beat, and that's when you want a pause or a delay in the line of dialogue that you've written. But others could be words like quietly, coughing, choking, laughing, etc. Although you sort of want to avoid directing on the page too much, so you should really reserve your parentheticals for when it's very important or when it is perhaps unclear how a line of dialogue is supposed to be delivered. If somebody is joking, for instance, but really your goal should be to make it clear from context. So parentheticals can be used to great effect, but I do urge caution with using them sparingly and wisely when you do. Some do's and don'ts of parentheticals are not to capitalize or punctuate anything inside the parentheses, not to use he or she because it will be clear from context, because you would only use a parenthetical to describe action that the person speaking is doing. Also to just keep them short and sweet, 1 or 2 lines at the most. And as I said, don't over-direct. Reserve your use of parentheticals for when it really matters. All right, the 4th element is transition, and transitions between scenes. And here the margins are going to be 6 inches from the left. Every screenplay begins with fade in, and every screenplay ends with fade out. Transitions between scenes could include things like dissolve to or match cut. Don't include cut to after every scene, it's obvious. As I will talk about in a little bit, in a spec script, you're not supposed to reference the camera. So these transitions get a little bit wobbly, whether that's really talking about the camera or not. So I encourage you to use them sparingly and only when they are very important for the storytelling that you're doing. So for instance, match cut is one that I think you could easily get away with using in a spec script. If you are trying to highlight that this is exactly the same thing that you were seeing in one scene as the thing that you are seeing in the next scene, using the transition of match cut is completely appropriate. But again, use sparingly. I will repeat that the Hollywood Standard is a great resource if you are interested in learning more about this or more specifics of formatting in general. So in our next lesson, I will get into some specific cases and how to format those instances that come up quite commonly. But if there's something in there that I don't mention that is an issue for your screenplay, I encourage you to check this out. I will see you then. Hello, and welcome back. Well, now that we've taken a look at generally how to format a screenplay, let's dig into a few specific scenarios that often come up when writing a screenplay. The first that I'll address are flashbacks, dream sequences, and anything else like an imaginary sequence. If it is a complete scene, you want to begin with flashback underlined in your slug line or scene heading, followed by whatever normally would come to describe that scene. Interior childhood bedroom day. In this case, it may be a situation where you want to be a little bit more specific with that time, perhaps providing a year instead. Interior childhood bedroom, July 1917. Could be something like that. If it's going to be something very quick, and you see these coming up more and more commonly in movies where you're just getting a flash of someone's memory, you might consider just putting in your action lines memory flash in all caps underlined, and then underneath that, whatever happens. The car careens around the corner, for example, and then a break, and you would continue with the scene that was happening before that memory flash. And these work for dream sequences and imaginary sequences. Another thing that you want to keep in mind is if it's clear when the flashback or dream sequence ends, you don't need to do anything in particular. However, if you get yourself into a situation where it's a little bit confusing when it ends, you might consider adding end flashback in all caps as a screen transition, which again is justified 6 inches from the left of the page. And that's only if it's needed for clarity. If it's very clear when your flashback or dream sequence is over, then you don't need to worry about it. Another thing that frequently comes up is how to superimpose text on screen. And this is very simple, actually, because all you have to write is superimpose in all caps with a colon, and then your message right there. And that means that that will end up on top of whatever image you are describing. Usually that's done on a separate line just so that it's clear and it stands out, that you have some description, superimpose, and then some more description. All right, another one that comes up for me frequently is a character who changes name. And this comes up a lot because a lot of the time when we first meet a character, we don't know who they are. For instance, somebody may come into a room and they do a few things before we learn their name. And so it's always kind of this tough situation where do you use their name before they've introduced themselves and trust that people are going to know who are reading your screenplay, that that's what's going on. But actually, here's how it should be handled. And I have an example here. And so we are in a casino lounge at night, and a well-dressed man walks into the lounge and sits down at the bar. Now, if this character were going to be unimportant, he could simply remain well-dressed man, and that would be totally fine. However, this well-dressed man is going to become our hero. So he delivers one line of dialogue to the bartender. Martini, shaken, not stirred. He turns to the beautiful blonde seated next to him. Now, here's where we indicate that there's a name change happening. We put his real name, which is of course James Bond, and then next to it, in parentheses, well-dressed man, just to be sure that we know that this transition is happening. And then he says, my name is Bond, James Bond. She giggles. And then from there on out, all of his dialogue is simply labeled as James Bond. Now, I would like to state that I completely made this up. This occurs in no James Bond movie, but it seemed good to illustrate the point. All right. The next one that comes up a lot is two people speaking simultaneously. And this can be confusing because if you try and put them right after one another, perhaps we don't realize the implication of what was going on. So actually the solution here is pretty simple, that we break it into 2 columns and run it right down the page. So here you can see that we have another example. We've got 2 girls sitting on a park bench and they're playing a guessing game. What color is the other one thinking? And at the end they're speaking at the same time. 1, 2, 3, red, blue. And there we have the highlight and the contrast laid out for us nicely. Sometimes you also have multiple people speaking at the same time. If you imagine a crowd of reporters, for instance, and here's another example of that. Now, you could break this out and have reporter number 1, reporter number 2, reporter number 3, and list their dialogue either side by side or one after another, and everybody would know that you were sort of going for this general babble effect. But if that's what you want and you're trying to save some space, you can also just list them speaking simultaneously as reporters and put some backslashes in there to indicate that somebody else is saying these things, so that we get sort of this this effect of lots of people speaking at the same time. So here you can see that we've got reporters outside the White House and Mr. President, how will this impact the war effort? When can we expect to see results? All said by different reporters. And then we'll talk about montages and voiceover. So voiceover is when a character who isn't present in the scene or is not speaking in the scene is doing something on top of what's going on. And this is very easy to indicate because all you do is in parentheses next to their character name, you put VO. You can also do off-screen this way, OS. But this is a great example of a montage. It's an interior-exterior montage. And this is actually out of one of my screenplays towards the beginning, How to Catch an Englishman. She's getting ready to graduate and move overseas. And so you can see here that each of these things doesn't really deserve its own scene heading because they are so quick, and they're designed to be seen sort of together to tell a complete story. So I've just indicated that they are separate from one another by almost bulleting them in this case, and each one is very short, 2 lines at the max. And this is one strategy for formatting a montage. I've also seen it done where you put the montage underlined at the beginning, similar to how you do a flashback. But I think that this is one of those situations where it's a little bit your personal taste, how you like to put those into your screenplay. So this has been a look at some of the specific instances that come up, and some of the most commonly encountered tricky situations, I would say. However, again, I encourage you that if I did not cover something here that you are dealing with in your screenplay, to check out the Hollywood Standard, which has tons of great information for your perusal. So I will see you in our next lesson. Well, hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, I'm going to give you a quick tutorial about how to use Celtx. So, this is what you see when you first open up Celtx. You can tell over here we have recent projects, so you can see what you've been working on recently, and quickly navigate to things, which is very helpful. Over here we have project templates, and you can feel free to explore these if you're working on perhaps a theater play or an audio play. But the one that we're going to be concerned with is this film template. So let's go ahead and open that up. So this is what you see when you first come to Celtx. So this is actually the script tab where you could actually begin typing. But before we get to that, let's talk about the title page, which is on a tab down here. So this is where you can put the title of your screenplay. So let's call this My Great Screenplay. Author by Danny Alcorn. And then down here is where you could put your contact information. So this would be something like Danny Alcorn, and then phone number down here, and maybe an email address or your physical address, depending on what your needs are. So that's pretty much all you have to see on that tab. Alright, so now let's go back to the script tab down here and begin writing. So up here, let's talk about a couple of buttons really quickly. What you're most interested in is this drop down right here, which has all of the information about what level and what type of text you're typing in. However, Celtx is pretty smart, and it will actually format a lot of this for you, which is really wonderful. So let's actually just explore that. So we're on a scene heading, and that's what we want because we're in a new scene. So let's say interior Danny's living room day. And now I've hit the enter key, and it's taken me down a line, and you'll notice that it's switched from being a scene heading to an action line, which is a line of description. So Danny and her friends sit in the living room. Now we can have dialogue, and I've hit the tab key, which has taken me over, and I'm now in the character, and this will be the character name. And so I'm not holding down the caps lock key. This is just the way that this is formatted, and you can see that that's done that for me. And when I hit the enter key now, it's going to take me into dialogue. So Danny is going to ask, "Who's ready for lunch?" Now, I've mentioned her friends, and actually one thing I guess I should say is that since this is the scene 1, Danny should be in all caps, and her friends, let's give them names, Amy and Jack, sit in the living room. There we go. All right, now we'll come back down here. Danny said, "Who's ready for lunch?" Amy's going to say, "I am," and Jack is going to say, "I am" as well. And now we will end this with they get up to leave. And then I hit enter, and if I hit enter again, it takes me into the next scene heading, which is really nice. So here we can have interior cafe later. Now another thing that I will just mention is that they walk into the cafe. Here it's going to remember character names, so if I type that D, it's going to remember Danny from before. So now Danny can say nice place. So we have the beginning of a little screenplay here. So this is formatted so that you can kind of get the gist of what it's going to look like, but this isn't the final formatting. And let's do one more thing, which is say that Amy and Jack, let's imagine that we wanted that to be a chorus, so that they said that at exactly the same time. So to do that, you highlight their text, as I've done, and then you click this button up here, which is the dual dialogue button. Now, it's not incredibly obvious what's happened when I click that, but you can tell it's put these little dialogue bubbles next to each other. But let's take a look at what this will actually look like when it is formatted as a screenplay. And to do that, you come down here and you click on this Typeset PDF tab. Now it's going to think for a moment as it goes through and formats it. And here we go. So let's scroll up to the top. So here you can see My Great Screenplay by Danny Alcorn. So this is the title page, and there's my contact information. And then here's the beginning of the screenplay. So we've got our scene 1 and our scene 2, and here you can see that we have Amy and Jack's dialogue appearing side by side, and this is now nicely formatted. I'm going to draw your attention to the Format Options box right here. Here's where you can control lots of things about how the screenplay gets displayed, like whether it has scene numbers or not. But remember, that's something that comes in later, so if you're writing a spec script, you probably want to leave that at none. And then here's where you can handle your mores and continueds. So this is usually how I leave mine set. This just means that at the bottom of a page, if a line of dialogue goes over onto the next page, it's indicated by more. And at the beginning of the next page, there is a continued next to the character name to indicate that they were already speaking. And I just find that to be a really clear way to look at it. So I'm going to leave it set like that for now. And then if you want to save a draft, which I do recommend frequently doing, you can click on this Save PDF button right here, and it will bring up something where you can save it wherever you'd like on your computer. I don't need to do that right now, so I'm just going to cancel. Let's see, what else? Oh, back on the script tab, there is one caution that I like to give, and that is that Celtx does not have reliable spell check real time. So every time I'm about to send pages off, I always make sure I go up here and click the spell check button. That's just a helpful tip because it doesn't always catch things as you're just typing in this view. So that's pretty much the basics of Celtx. There are some interesting things that you can get it to do, like the index cards feature is kind of nice. So there's an index card for each scene that I have created. So they don't have any information on them right now, but let's say that I wanted to jot some notes about scene 3. So I just come down here and I would say scene 3. And now scene 1 and scene 2 were both sort of my A plot. But let's say that I wanted to introduce a B plot. I would come down here and I would click this plot A region, and then it will bring this up. And you can see that I have different labels. So these could be subplots, but maybe I would just like to categorize, instead of having an A plot and a B plot exactly, maybe I'd just like to keep track of which scenes have the antagonist in them, if I'm writing a mystery or something like that. So I can label this the antagonist and say okay. And now that's turned my index card blue, and it's also given it this little label down here. So then I could type some notes in about introduce antagonist. He's the waiter, but Danny doesn't know. And so that I can come back later and look at this. I can also shuffle these around if I decided I wanted to move some scenes around, which is really nice. But for now, let's just leave that alone. And if you want to take notes about a scene, you can come to this scratch pad tab down here, and then you can just type in here something like that, which is helpful frequently. And then the last thing that I will point out is this Master Catalog tab. And this is where all of your characters are displayed. And so if we look at Danny, we can tell that right now there's not a lot of information in here, but we could add a full name, we could add a description, we can see which scenes she's in, that she speaks, and then we can start adding some of the things that you did in your character description in terms of what she looks like, what the traits are. Motivations can be really helpful. So sometimes if you're feeling stuck with a character, it's nice to come in here and fill in a few of these things and think about them. But this is really just a tool for you to use and help keep things organized. I honestly tend not to use these features so much. I just use it as the actual script writing because I usually am working in Word documents prior to starting work on my screenplay. But you can see up here that we've just got a couple of different tabs, so we can switch back and forth between the screenplay and the master catalog. So that's a quick intro to Celtx. I find it to be really easy to use, and you can't beat the price at free. So I recommend checking this out and playing with it a little bit. After you work with it for even 10 or 15 minutes, the navigation using the Enter and Tab keys becomes very simple and straightforward. Anyway, that's Celtx. So I hope that you have enjoyed this quick look at the program, and I will look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. Well, now we're going to talk about great screenwriting, what belongs and what doesn't. But before we begin that discussion, we need to talk about what kind of script it is that you're actually writing. Now, the vast majority of you are probably writing spec scripts. And this is when you're writing something without an assignment or contract. You're writing it because you have a great idea and you want to get it down on paper, and you'll worry about selling it, the finished product, at a later date. That's a very different kind of script than a shooting script. A shooting script is the draft that is written when a movie is going into production. And it is actually a product of the combined efforts of the writer, director, and cinematographer. And as a result, it has additional information that you wouldn't find in a spec script. Now, the difference between spec scripts and shooting scripts from a content level is that your spec script should not contain any references to the camera. Now, there are some specifics in terms of formatting. Other than that, either version can have the word continued at the bottom of a page where a scene continues on to the next page. All shooting scripts will have that, but it is not wrong for a spec script to have it. It's just a matter of your personal preference, and it is a setting that you will find in your screenwriting software. However, there is one hard and fast difference. Only shooting scripts should have scene numbers at the end of the scene heading. Your spec script should not have scene numbers. But I'm sure that the one that you are all worried about is that no camera moves are allowed. Never mention the camera. It's an amateur move that will immediately signal that your screenplay was written by somebody who's not in the know as far as the business is concerned. However, there is a way to achieve your goal, and that is to be clever. Now, how are you going to be clever and get that beautiful shot that you just wish you could call whatever it is into your screenplay? And the way to be clever is to describe the image in such a way that it could not possibly be shot any other way. So here's an example. And as I read this, I'd like you to imagine what it is that I am describing and what kind of shot it is that I want to be here. The straps of her pink high heels wrap around delicate ankles, buckling below toned calves. The hem of her pink dress flutters. She carries an expensive designer bag. It wiggles, and a chihuahua pokes his head out the top, sniffing. She pats his head, then raises her hand to wave, smiling, tossing her perfect blonde hair. Now what kind of shot have I just described? It's clearly a pan from her feet to the top of her head. How else could you shoot that? but I managed to avoid using the phrase pan up, and while I know that we're supposed to be reserving space, this is one of those cases where you're just going to have to outthink your director and come up with a way to lead him seamlessly and unknowingly into your trap of filming it exactly the way that you would like it to be filmed. So, beyond that, the basics of good screenwriting are that action lines should be written in the present tense. So, present tense is Bond picks up the gun, past is Bond picked up the gun. Since you are seeing something in front of you, tradition dictates that it's written in the present tense. Now, screenplays should be well written, but remember that you're not writing a novel. Your goal is to be thorough, visual, and brief. You do want to use correct punctuation in your action lines, and you also want to use a style that helps tell your story, i.e. having a consistent tone. So, if you were working on a comedy, you could write your action lines in a way that was sort of funny or tongue-in-cheek, a little bit over the top, and that would help convey the tone that you're going for. But that would be inappropriate if you were writing a drama. So if you're writing a drama, you want to use a tone that matches that. That's a little bit more serious, perhaps, a little bit more restrained. The goal really is to help your readers see the movie the way that you want it to be seen. And so you're describing the images that they will actually see, but it is to your benefit to describe them in a way that will help make it visceral and real for them. So what belongs in a screenplay? Well, anything that you can see or that you can hear. What doesn't belong are invisible things, which means no emotions and no backstory. So a very bad sentence that you would never want to see in a screenplay is, "She feels sad because her dog ran away." That violates all of the rules right there. We've just been told that she feels sad, but you can't really see an emotion. You have to figure out what the visual manifestation of some emotion is. And we also can't see because her dog ran away. We're going to have to come up with a way to be a little bit more clever about how we describe that. So here's the good version of that. She looks at the empty doghouse. She sniffs and wipes her nose on her sleeve. That's very visual. That tells a visual story and lets us know the same information that the other sentence did. She's clearly upset and her dog is gone. So we've gotten all of that into a form that will help the director and cinematographer tell the story in the way that movies are told rather than the way that novels are told. And this is an ultimate example of having to learn how to show, not tell. Because if you can't see it, your audience can't know it in a movie. Some really common techniques, if you need to cover backstory in particular in a visual way, is to pan over photographs on a wall or on a table or something like that. That can help sort of visually clue you in. You can work it into dialogue a lot of the time to have characters talk about it. And then what you'll become very good at as you continue working on your screenplays are figuring out the physical manifestations of different emotions. You don't realize how much of a blessing it is if you're working on short stories or novels that you can get away with saying that somebody is sad, because suddenly when you're writing a screenplay, you have to come up with all of the behaviors and the way that somebody looks when they are sad, or any of the emotions. You'll really become a student of human nature as you begin to work on this. Something else that you don't want to do is you don't want to direct on the page. You can't micromanage an actor's performance, and you can't do the director's job for them. You need to think of your screenwriting like impressionistic painting. It's true that you're trying to paint a visual picture, but you need to sort of suggest the outline and shape and form, leaving enough room for a director and an actor to add the details later and fill it in. Now, that said, if you are going to direct your own script, then you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can be as detailed or as vague. I've heard that the Coen brothers' shooting scripts are almost blank compared to most others because they knew what they were going to do, so they're not worried about it. But most of us won't be in this position. So when you're tempted to sort of leap in there and say, oh, I really want the protagonist to be doing this at the moment, take a step back and ask yourself how important that is to the scene and the screenplay overall and the arc that they're occurring, and go for the ones that are the most important. If it's just something that would be kind of nice, or that's how you would do it if you were directing, think about leaving it out. If it is something that is actually going to be pivotal to the way that your story is interpreted or read, that's a time where you do want to sort of jump in there and be a little bit more direct with what you're talking about. When writing a screenplay, your primary goal is always clarity. Never make your reader think, wait, what's going on? What's happening? And have to go back to the beginning of a scene or even several scenes ago to figure out where you are now. You always want to make sure that we know who is doing what to whom and where and when they are, because if that piece of information is lost, it becomes hard to understand your screenplay, and if it becomes hard to understand your screenplay, it becomes hard to visualize what it will look like when it is completed. So, test drive for this week is to pick a short scene from a movie that you like. Step 1 is to rewatch it. Step 2 is to try and write it as it might have appeared in the script, focused on what you can see and hear, trimming out the irrelevant details. This is a great exercise to sort of get you thinking about what can be left out and what can't be in terms of conveying what makes it from page to screen. So I invite you to try that out, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about writing great dialogue. Now, before we launch into how to write great dialogue, let's talk about the purpose of dialogue. To begin, dialogue should do at least one of the following, and preferably both. It should advance the plot or reveal character. This means you want to avoid chit-chat and conversations that are ultimately meaningless to your script in terms of the plot or the character. And you also want to get to the point of a scene or conversation as quickly as possible. For instance, have you ever noticed that no one says goodbye on the phone in movies? That's because it doesn't accomplish anything. They also usually don't say, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, how are you? Same story. That's the irrelevant piece of the conversation. We want to get to the meat of what they're going to say. So this is true whether they're on the phone or speaking with another person. So, what makes dialogue great? Well, it should sound natural. It should also be consistent for each character. Not all of the characters should sound alike, and it should be original. Now let's break down each of those and talk a little bit more about them. So in terms of sounding natural, you want to make sure that you're using appropriate language choice. This could be for a variety of reasons. Age level, education level could all influence the words that somebody may or may not know. You want to make sure that you're using appropriate expressions and idioms. So this could be where somebody is from. For example, I grew up in Florida, and there we call, like Coke would be soda, but I moved up to the Midwest for college and discovered that everyone here calls it pop. Now, if I were writing a character who came from Chicago and had them talking about their Diet Coke and calling it soda, it wouldn't ring quite as true as if they were talking about their pop. Another great example, instead of being a geographic issue, is a temporal issue. So for instance, the phrase catch-22 has become completely integrated into casual speech. But Catch-22, the book, wasn't published until 1961. So if you were writing a character or a story that happened before that, you could get into major trouble by slipping in what is a very modern coinage. Instead, you would want to consider using a word like conundrum. Another thing to keep in mind in terms of making speech sound natural is that people use contractions when they speak. The only time that you will ever hear somebody not use a contraction is when they are really trying to make a point. So that should be reflected in your dialogue. But for the most part, people should say don't and can't. But when they are really trying to emphasize something, I cannot do this, that would be a time where you could use the full expression. Another thing to keep in mind is that people don't speak in complete sentences. And you don't want to go crazy with this because you do want clarity to come through for your reader and your audience. But it's good to keep in mind that people just sort of trail off and don't finish the thought that they were having. So when you write, it's good to sort of keep that in mind and throw in just enough of it to make it sound like somebody is actually speaking while maintaining clarity. The same caution applies to the next point, which is that people interrupt and talk over one another all the time. That's completely fine to do, and in fact, some movies and television shows, Moonlighting springs to mind, made entire shticks out of the fact that the characters spoke over one another and never listened to a thing the other one said. So if that's something that you're going for, that's great. But again, you want to use those sparingly and avoid sacrificing clarity for realism in this case. Consistency. You want each character to have a strong and unique voice. Ideally, the goal is that given any line out of context, you should be able to tell which character out of a movie said it. So some examples that spring to mind, perhaps drastically, Yoda from Star Wars. You would not confuse one of his lines of dialogue with anyone else in that movie. Some other sort of great examples would be Doc Brown from Back to the Future. He has a very distinctive way of speaking. There's a character from a movie called If You Believe that is, her name is Robin, and she never finishes a sentence. In fact, it's so much of a shtick that it actually is talked about by the other characters that she just goes on run-on sentences all of the time without ever finishing a single one of them. So you could go to the extreme like that for a character, but you can also pull it back and make it a little bit simpler in terms of keeping them straight from one another, because it gets boring if all of your characters sound alike. Which leads us to the next point, which is that you want to give your characters unique voices. Because if everyone in the movie was talking the same way, it would get boring pretty fast. So you want to make people sound unique. So some examples that I thought of off the top of my head were Huckleberry Finn versus Jim versus Tom Sawyer. All three of those characters speak very differently from one another for a variety of reasons. Another great example is from the movie The Fifth Element. You have Corbin Dallas, Ruby Rhod, and Lilu. And again, you would not confuse a line of dialogue that any of those characters spoke with something that somebody else would say. And then finally, as sort of a fun example, Timon versus Pumbaa in The Lion King. Again, very different from one another. In terms of originality, you want to avoid cliches. Sometimes they slip in there, and you just have to weed them out as you go and come up with a new way of saying whatever it was that you were trying to say. And you also want to avoid using other people's memorable lines unless you're doing it on purpose. For example, no one will ever be able to say, "You had me at hello," without referencing When Harry Met Sally. So if that's something that is unique to your character, if they are always quoting other people, that would be a great way to make them different from everybody else. But know that your audience and your reader is going to pick up on that as well and not confuse it with something that is your own original work. So, in terms of making natural sounding dialogue and getting your head wrapped around how people actually talk, this week's test strive is to go to a public place, like a cafe, a park, a beach. Maybe if you commute, listen to somebody on the train instead of listening to your iPods one morning, and just eavesdrop on a conversation around you. Bring a notebook, maybe jot down any observations you have about the way people speak. Do they use an interesting filler phrase when they don't know what to say? I've noticed that people in the Midwest tend to use "but when they're stalling for time, whereas other regions, it's simply an or an that gets filled in. Maybe somebody begins a sentence with the same phrase. Do people finish sentences? And what slang expressions are they using? So, I hope that you have fun with that, and I will look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about writing great action lines. Now, a lot of this information was in the great screenwriting section because the bulk of your screenplay will be action lines. So a little bit will be review, but some will be new as well. So let's talk about the mechanics. The first thing to know is that you must write in present tense. That's a style thing that is just how screenplays are written because you're experiencing them in the moment. I know it's very hard, but you also never want to mention the camera. camera moves will go into your screenplay, but in a much later draft, and they'll be something that the director and the cinematographer do together. So there are tips and tricks for getting it to be shot exactly the way that you want, but it comes down to being clever in the way that you describe things. So the example I gave previously was that if you want a pan up from someone's feet to the top of their head, the way that you describe that person is you begin by talking about their shoes and then what they're wearing for pants or a skirt, and going up and adding details until you finally get to their face. And then there's really only one way to shoot that, and so you have cleverly led the director and cinematographer into your clever little trap, and they will be forced to pan up on that character to introduce them. The other thing that you want for your action lines is that you want them to be very visual. There should not be a lot of backstory or invisible things in your action lines, because you can't put that on screen. The goal is that everything in the action line should be able to be physically shot and captured, so you should be able to see it. You also want to be thorough but brief. Keep your action lines well below 4 lines. In fact, it's usually better if you can keep them to 2 or less. And in fact, if you can get it onto 1 line, that's great. You really want maximum bang for your buck. You don't want to be too wordy here. You want it to read quickly. And you do want to use correct punctuation and grammar, just so that you come off as a professional. So, what belongs in an action line is anything you can see or hear. And what doesn't belong are invisible things. So that means no backstory and no emotions. And emotions can be tricky, so you have to figure out how to visually convey an emotion. However, my rule of thumb is that you are entitled to 1, maybe 2 indulgences in a screenplay, so that at a very pivotal moment, you can slip ever so slightly inside a character's head and maybe reveal a little bit about how they're feeling or what they're thinking, if it's very important for telling your story. But you don't want to go too far. You want that to be just a brief moment, but to really snag your reader and make them empathize with the character that you're talking about. All right. Now, screenwriting is the ultimate exercise in show don't tell, because you have to directly convey emotion or backstory without being able to have a voiceover that basically tells your audience what you wanted them to know. You have to figure out how to do it on screen. So your choices are to describe it visually. So if you have a protagonist who is sad, you might show them crying, which we will automatically associate with sadness. Or if there's important backstory, you can bring it up in dialogue. And you want to be careful that you don't have characters talking too much about things that happened in the past, but you can slip little references in and work in backstory in a clever way. Another way to work in backstory visually might be establishing a location where there are photographs. Establishing family relationships is very frequently done that way in movies. If you think about the first few minutes of a film, perhaps there's a sort of pan over a nightstand or a desk that has family photographs that will tell you a little bit about something, a little bit about the character and who's going to be important or important relationships in the past. Okay. You also don't want to direct on the page, and by that I mean you can't do the director's job or the actor's job for them. You can't micromanage that, and so you need to think of screenwriting like impressionism, where you are sort of painting with these very broad strokes to create the outline and impression of something. But you have to leave room for the actors and the director to bring their own artistic feelings and creativity to it as well, to sharpen those details. So you really want to describe only the nuances that will help tell your story or reveal character. Now let me give you an example to sort of explain what I'm talking about here. One of those is, let's say that hypothetically your character is in the kitchen making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Now, let's say that she's upset because her boyfriend has just broken up with her. Now, here's a detail that would be important in that scene. She could pick up a framed photograph of the two of them, look at it for a moment, and then do something to it. She could throw it in the trash, she could put it lovingly back on the shelf, she could turn it over so that she can't see it anymore, and then continue making her peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Now, details that do not belong in this scene are going to the cupboard, getting the bread, opening the fridge, taking out the peanut butter, unscrewing the top, making the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Everybody knows how to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and you don't need to clutter your screenplay with doing that. If you write, the character makes a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the actor, director, and everybody involved is going to make sure that the peanut butter and jelly sandwich gets made. Those are details that we can fill in for ourselves. Now, there is a small exception to a detail that you might include if it were going to be very important later on, either in terms of revealing character or if it's a clue. So maybe this is a mystery or something like that, and your character has this quirk that she only eats peanut butter and jelly with strawberry jam. Now, if that strawberry jam is really important, like it's going to be a clue later on, or it's going to come back because the case is solved when someone finds fingerprints in strawberry jam somewhere else and figures out that this is the character, that's a detail that you could include in the process of making the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So again, just focus on those nuances that are actually relevant to your story and will reveal character or help you set up things later on. Alright, action lines, you also want to be brief. Use the minimum number of words possible. Identify the details that will instantly paint the most complete and vivid picture, but allow the reader to imagine the rest. And wherever possible, sneak in description through a character's actions. Because remember, you're writing a moving picture. So if you can figure out how to describe a room or a setting through what the character is doing, you will have a much more compelling action line, and you will create a much more compelling space because you won't have this sort of slowdown as you describe every detail in someone's living room, say. And I will just caution that scripts are often rejected for having too much description, too much black, which is very thick, dense paragraphs of action lines and description. And so that's why you want to really trim it down and keep it to less than 4 and ideally 2 lines of description at a time, broken up by dialogue and other screen elements. So let's take a look at some examples of how you can very quickly paint a compelling picture of not just one room, but a person's entire house, and perhaps say something about their character as well. So what I'm going to show you are 4 scene headings followed by descriptions of a woman's living room. And I'd like you to try and imagine what this woman's living room looks like based on only the few details that I have provided. And then think about what this person's kitchen looks like. What does their bedroom look like? Are they a neat freak? Is there clutter everywhere? What kind of appliances do they have? And I think you'll be amazed to discover that you can create 4 completely different environments based on, in some cases, less than 9 words. All right, let's take a look. The first one is interior, Jane's living room, day. Ratty plastic kids' toys litter the floor. Now, what does her kitchen look like? What kind of house does she live in? All right, let's take a look at the second example. Interior, Samantha's living room, day. A steaming plate of fresh-baked cookies sits on top of a doily on a gleaming coffee table. A little different, right? A third. Interior, Amy's living room, day. An exercise bike sits in front of a state-of-the-art flat-screen TV. Now, Amy seems very different than either Jane or Samantha so far, and I'm sure that based only on the description of where these people live, you can also begin to construct images of what these people may look like in your head. And finally, we have interior, Jennifer's living room, day. Curtains soften the light streaming into a room of mismatched but cozy furniture. Now, take another look at those 4 different rooms and think about how few details and how few words were used to describe each environment. And yet, if you think about the kinds of furniture that you would find in a living room described that way, the person who would live there, what their kitchen looks like, what their bedroom looks like, other characteristics about them, like what kind of car they drive, you can instantly begin making educated guesses about that. So that's the power of really refining your descriptions and your action lines into these very condensed but visually compelling sentences. Now, the only thing that could really be done to improve these is to get the same description in through action. So I'm going to take Jane's living room and describe that using action. So here we go. Interior, Jane's living room, day. Jane kicks aside one of the ratty plastic kids' toys littering her floor. Same information, but now we have a character interacting in the space, revealing details about it through what she is doing. All right. Now, to sum up, your primary goal when writing action lines is clarity. You never want to make your reader stop and go back to reread something. At every moment, the reader should know where the scene is, who is there, and who's doing the action. If you keep that in mind, you will end up with amazing action lines that will tell a visual and compelling story and will keep your reader flying through and turning pages. So your test drive for this week is to take Samantha, Amy, and Jennifer's living rooms and rewrite that description using action. But at first, try and keep it under a paragraph, and ultimately see if you can whittle it down to a single sentence to reveal all of the same details that were in the static description in the first place. So here they are again if you need them for reference, but give that a try, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about writing great character introductions. Now, to begin, why is this important? Well, this is how you will help your readers remember who all the characters are. We have a major advantage when we're watching a movie because our brain's facial recognition center is amazing, and we can easily keep track of 20 or 30 faces in a movie and know who each person is and keep track of them. But we couldn't keep track of 20 or 30 names. And yet that's what we're asking our readers to do when they look at one of our screenplays. Yes, we're turning it into a visual medium, but we need to do everything that we can do to help the reader along with us and keep track of who we're introducing into our screenplay. So, there's also a secondary consideration that if you write a really good hook for an actor, they'll read your screenplay and say, yes, this is a character I want to be, this is definitely for me. And so that can be advantageous when you get to a certain point. But really what we're concerned with is how to make it memorable for somebody who's reading your screenplay. And the key to that is really specificity. So I'm going to take you through an example, building it up, making it more and more memorable by adding more and more details to it. So to begin with, a man walks into a bar. That could be a lot of people. So let's get a little bit more specific. We're going to tack on another descriptor to this man. Now we have a clumsy man walks into the bar. That's getting better. So now if we saw clumsy man later in the script, we'd probably remember, oh, okay, he came in the scene, okay, I got you. But now we need to give him something to do that's really going to drive home his clumsiness. So here we have a clumsy man trips on the threshold and stumbles into the bar. This is better. We have now given our reader something to identify this person with. We have shown that, in fact, he has earned his title of clumsy man. But now, let's make it really memorable. Let's add some details and really drive home this guy's character. So here we go. A clumsy man trips on the threshold and stumbles into the bar. He recovers his balance and adjusts his cowboy hat like nothing happened. Not looking, he hits his head on the low-hanging chandelier. Now we're going to remember who this guy is. So that's why it's important to spend a little bit of time thinking about how you want your character to be introduced. Because not only do we need to make it memorable, this is also your chance to say a significant amount about the person who you're introducing, to provide our first impression. It's true that there is nothing like a first impression, and so if somebody's introduction into a scene is just a little bit lackluster, it's going to be an uphill battle for us to think of them as taking center stage later on. And so you really want to pay attention to this when the character is going to be a recurring character, introduced in one scene and comes back multiple times throughout, particularly for characters who are central, like your protagonist, antagonist, love interest, and things like that. You want to make sure that they have extra strong character introductions. But even the supporting characters, and the more that you can do, the more details that you can add to sort of spice up the world in which your character lives, is that a character introduction is a really seamless place to add in details about the kind of world that your character lives in. Even if you're just describing the bartender or somebody who's only going to be in one scene, taking the extra couple of minutes to think about how to introduce them in a way that makes them maybe just a little bit different than every other bartender that you've seen in a movie can help make your script stand out and feel very real. So that's it for this week, and I will look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about pacing. Now, this is perhaps one of the most important but hardest to quantify elements of a great screenplay. So to begin, let's ask the question, how do you know if a movie was poorly paced? Well, a tip-off is if you fall asleep at the same spot every time you try and watch it. Another could be if you leave the theater thinking, wow, if I only could have had a pair of scissors and an hour in the editing room, I could totally have fixed that movie. Or the action could be so unrelenting you feel exhausted after you finish watching it. Some common problems are the slow starter. And I'm going to call out a movie here that I actually really like a lot, but it's Evita. 1996, starring Madonna and Antonio Banderas, and it's a great film. It really is. But the first 10 minutes are very slow, and it's hard for people who haven't seen the movie before or aren't familiar with the history that it's covering to sort of latch onto something and get interested and excited. And 10 minutes is a long time to be feeling a little bit out of the loop and like you don't know what's going on and don't really know where it's going. And so a bit of this may be that attention spans are shortening, but you want to make sure that your movie catches people right from the very beginning, because if it doesn't, you risk them either closing the screenplay or turning the movie off. Another really common problem is the unrelenting action thriller. And here I'm going to call out a movie called Wanted that came out in 2008. And I admit that I haven't seen this movie since I saw it in 2008, because my recollection is that it was just solid action for the second half. There was no break, there was no breather, and so you just got inundated with gunfights and action scenes and chases and never had a chance to sort of stop, take a breath, and reflect on what you'd just seen or make it make sense, which meant that by the time you got to the end of the movie, you were just sort of exhausted and ready to go home. Another really common problem are third acts that drag. And here I'm calling out a movie called Kissing Jessica Stein from 2001. And this was an unusual romantic comedy about a sort of forbidden relationship. And the first two acts are very well paced. They keep you on the side of the two romantic leads, you're rooting for them, and then the movie's over at the end of Act 2. At least that's how it feels. And then Act 3 goes on and on and on. And at some point, that's almost as bad as a slow start, because you've had this great thing and you just didn't know when to call it quits. So this is why you want to make sure that your screenplay does not drag on too long after the climax, because people are ready to sort of say, yay, we got what we wanted, get the resolution, and then tie it up and end the screenplay. Some other common problems are the stop everything and develop a romance because we're trying to appeal to a broader audience. That happens in action movies a lot. So these are some pacing problems that you just want to be aware of and be checking for in your own screenplay to make sure that you're not falling prey to them. So let's talk about well-paced films. So a well-paced film will keep things moving forward and it never feels boring, but it will pause long enough to let the audience or your reader digest the events or take a breather from an intense action sequence. And it will also do a good job of balancing story and plot. And again, the difference between story and plot is that story is the emotional content of your character's journey, and plot is the physical getting from point A to point B and the action that accomplishes that. So a movie that I would like to talk about here as an example of an extremely well-paced film is The Fifth Element. And this has three major genres all in one. It's an action, it's a romance, and it's a comedy, and all of those elements are balanced throughout the film. The action sequences are intercut with quieter moments that let you reflect on and pause between the action sequences, which actually heightens the tension, each one as it gets more and more intense and more action-packed, because you have a chance to sort of sit back, take a moment between each one. Each one new feels like you're ready for it, and you're not numb to it. So there's a sequence towards the beginning that's a great example of this. So Lilu breaks out of the government facility, which is a fairly action-packed sequence that culminates in her diving off of this incredibly tall building and ultimately landing in the back seat of Corbin's car. Now, that's a very action-packed sequence, but it is followed by this quiet moment in the taxi as he's talking to her and she's asking for help. Now, when she asks for help, he finally agrees, and this kicks off our second action sequence, which is this car chase throughout this futuristic world that is, again, very action-packed. And that ends, again, with a quiet moment in the taxi where she asks to be taken to Cornelius. Now, this constant interplay between action and reaction and action and rest really helps keep the movie paced well and doesn't make the audience feel like they're just being inundated with action. Towards the end of the movie also, the action sequence gets longer, but it's still being interspersed with sort of light comedic moments. Things like the "anybody else want to negotiate" line that gets in there, and, you know, no, it can't be a bomb because if we're bombed, the alarms would be going off, cue alarms. Those lighter moments keep the intense action from feeling so overwhelming. So again, well-paced films are really wonderful to watch because you're being led along an absolute roller coaster of ups and downs. Now, here are some tips for pacing your screenplay and making sure that it turns out the way that you want it to. The first one is simply to make sure that your act breaks are occurring at the correct moments. So you want your Act 1 to be about 30 minutes, you want your Act 2 to be about 60 minutes, and you want your Act 3 to come in at 30 minutes or less. If those are wildly different, you probably have a pacing problem on your hands where one of them is going to feel like it's dominating. Maybe your Act 2 drags on. If Act 3 is really long, you may have that this movie needs to end and you just need to pick a moment where it is over. And again, it's very hard to pick an absolute hard and fast for what an average scene length is, but probably in a well-paced movie, it's 2 to 3 pages, so it's 2 to 3 minutes, with some shorter scenes and some longer scenes. If you're drastically different from that, you may want to take a step back and evaluate whether or not the film is still paced the way that you want it to be. And it might be. Some films are simply paced slower than others, and that's partially a style and partially a genre constraint. And so it's just something to bear in mind. And then finally, I think that the best way is you have to hear the completed product out loud, or at least large chunks of it. And so if you're part of a writing group, or if you have some friends, buy them pizza, ask them to come over and do a reading of your screenplay while you take notes on it. And they can probably also give you feedback if where it seemed like it was dragging a little bit, where they needed a break, where they were most interested in, things like that. So make sure that you get feedback from them, but also it's good for you to hear it from start to finish at least once as you're working on it. So I will look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. Now that we've talked about all of the ways that you can make your screenplay great, we're going to talk about how to actually finish a screenplay. Now, this is my own advice, so take what works for you and ignore the rest. But I have 6 points that I'd like to take you through. And so the first is to know where you're going. Have a plan. This is your outline, your roadmap, and your character sketches. And this will keep your writing from becoming what happens when you write a great first act and then lose steam after that because you've lost inspiration, you didn't really know where you were going. So definitely having these materials with you before you launch into really committing and writing your screenplay will help you make it past that act break. The second point is just write. Write, just do it. Everyone writes a few pages of dreck when they sit down and start. And it can be a little bit frustrating, a little bit hard, and you sit there for a few minutes and you think, I'm totally uninspired, I don't know what I'm writing, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't want to do this. But if you sit there and you just push through it for 10 or 15 minutes, you'll have to throw away that first page that you wrote, but then you'll be into the good stuff because you'll be warmed up and ready to go. So I really think that this is perhaps the most important, is to simply set the time aside to do it and do it. The third point, as I mentioned, is don't stop after 30 pages. Writing Act 1 is easy. That's the honeymoon phase. That is when you are excited about your idea and you think that you have the next Academy Award winner on your hands and you are inspired and you are ready to go. And then you get to Act 2 and it's hard. Sustaining all of the suspense and the pacing and keeping the characters consistent through Act 2 can be really challenging. But push through, because once you get through Act 2, which will be much easier with your outline and your roadmap in hand, then you're more than halfway there. And by the time you've gotten through Act 1 and Act 2, a lot of the time, Act 3 writes itself. Because if you've done a good job keeping track of your 9 checkpoints throughout, you know exactly what has to happen, and you've now got a handle on your characters and how they sound and how they react to things, and that Act 3 is going to be a breeze. And nothing feels as good as typing the end when you get to the final page, so it's totally worth it to push through. My fourth piece of advice is don't rewrite as you go. It's tempting to play wordsmith and be critical of your work as you go along, but don't stop in the middle and start editing from the beginning. Keep your momentum going forward. You will have plenty of time for rewrites later, and we will talk in depth about what goes into a rewrite and a successful rewrite in the next chunk of lessons. So, don't rewrite, just keep going. 5, find patterns that work for you. Now, this is important because you should plan to work when you know that you'll be the most creative and productive. If you're not a morning person, getting up an hour early to work is not going to help you because you're going to be tired and cranky. But if you are a morning person, spend that time. Get up an hour early and spend a little bit time with your screenplay. If you're a night owl, same thing, make a cup of tea and settle in for the evening with your screenplay. Whatever it is, make a plan and stick to it. So finally, I will say that my 6th piece of advice is to set deadlines for yourself. You want to make sure that they're realistic, but you want to hold yourself to them. Now, the length of time that you want to spend doing this could be very different depending on how quickly you write, how long you want to spend in the ideas phase before you launch into the writing. There are many considerations to keep track of as you're setting these goals. But just as a point of reference, if you were a professional screenwriter and you were hired to write a screenplay, so a producer called you up and said, I need a screenplay about X, would you like to do it? And you say, yes, absolutely, you would have 10 to 12 weeks to do it. So that's kind of the benchmark, if you will. Now, that's if you're probably devoting your full-time effort to screenwriting. I have found personally that I spend more time in the ideas phase than I do in the actual writing phase. Once I get to the writing phase, I tend to be a little bit obsessive about it and I just want to get it done. So I will usually allow myself more time at the beginning to think about things, work on my outline, put it away for a while, consider it, and then once I actually get into the writing, it's usually a pretty fast process. Now, you may have the opposite. You may instantly come up with the idea and know exactly what you're doing and want to really linger over the writing and spend a long time on each scene, crafting it and making it the way that you would like. But as long as you're moving forward, any of these approaches is absolutely fine. So I hope that you will find these useful as you now take your completed outline and all of the things that you have learned in this set of lessons about writing great screenplays and begin working on your own. And I will look forward to seeing you in the next set of lessons where we talk about rewriting. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about workshops and why they're so important. But to start, let's define what a workshop is. So a workshop is a group of people who listen to your ideas and give you feedback on them, read your screenplay, preferably out loud so you can hear it, And finally, provide comments, both positives and negatives, on your work. So why would you want to workshop? Well, no one can work in a vacuum. You need to hear what's working so you can do more of it, and you need to hear what's not working so you can fix it and make it better. And sitting alone in your living room, it's very easy to lose perspective. And this really applies at all stages of the writing process, whether it's coming up with ideas, working on that first draft, second draft, third draft, or the 15th draft. It's always good to get somebody else's input and make you reevaluate the things that you are focused on. Maybe you've been really focused on something and you've finally nailed it, but you're still thinking about it, but you've been neglecting other aspects. Someone who comes in who's maybe not quite so invested in it in the way that you are can take a look at that and say, oh, you know, the dialogue in this scene really isn't working. The description's great, but it sounds corny. And that's your cue to go in and spend some time working on that. So, since I brought up dialogue, I think that that's one of the most important things about hearing your screenplay out loud, is getting somebody to read that dialogue cold, because you know how you want it to be delivered. But you may discover that a pivotal line in your screenplay reads all wrong or doesn't sound natural suddenly when it's being said out loud. You'll also catch awkward phrasing. And one of the simplest ones, but I think comes out a lot in a read-through, is that you'll catch speech that's way too formal. For example, you may have written out I am versus I'm, but people are very sloppy when they speak, and so most of the time, unless that is in there for emphasis, you're going to want to use contractions. People just don't tend to use do not, cannot, I am in sentences very frequently, unless it's for emphasis. So that's a really good thing that you can hear in a workshop as well. When you have a completed draft, it's also really important to hear it from start to finish, because it's much easier to tell how the pacing works when you're hearing it at approximately the same rate that you'd see it. When you sit down to read a screenplay, it's hard to imagine how fast that will go, and it's also easy to focus in on one particular section of it, neglecting the work as a whole. Just because it's tempting, if you sit down and start reading from beginning to end, you see something you want to make a note, you stop, you edit it a little bit, but getting a chance to sit down and hear a whole bunch of people read it for you, you can imagine what you would be seeing and hearing in a movie theater. And occasionally you do catch things where, oh, this scene went by way too quickly, I need to slow it down a little bit, or, you know, this was really too long, I need to get from point A to point C much faster, so let's see what we can do to trim B a little bit. And also, hearing it from start to finish just gives you another chance to take a step back and get that big picture view again and see how the whole thing fits together. And maybe that scene that you're really in love with in the middle just isn't contributing, and this is the time where you're going to figure that out and realize that maybe it's time to start trimming things like that. Okay, now clearly workshops are beneficial and you can get a whole lot out of them, but it is also very easy to offend people in a workshop. So let's talk about workshop etiquette a little bit. So when you are working on your own writing, go in having a plan. And by this I mean know how many characters there are, who can be double cast, and so on. Nobody wants to sit down, have you pass out the scripts, and then spend the next 15 minutes as you try and flip through it figuring out, oh yeah, I need grocery store worker number 7. Have a plan. And that will expedite the process and keep everything running smoothly. You should also not read any parts yourself, particularly the main character or action lines. And this is because this is your opportunity to hear it out loud, and you don't want to be spending time thinking about when is my next line, what do I have to say. You want to be able to sit there and be the movie watcher. You should just be able to experience everything, listening to what everyone else is saying. Now, that said, I usually will designate someone, if I have a large group of people, to be the dead silence person, where let's say I have forgotten a character who had only one line, and if we get to that in the script and no one says anything, this person will pick that line up and read it, whoever it is. Occasionally in a smaller group, if I already have people who are heavily, you know, perhaps even triple, quadruple, or quintuple cast, occasionally I will be the dead silence person. So if I have forgotten, you know, Starbucks worker number 17, I'll just pick that up. That's not a big deal. But you don't want to be doing any serious reading. You do just want to be sitting there getting a chance to listen to your work as a whole. Now, this is really important, but at the end, when the last line is spoken and somebody gets to the last page, do not jump in and start explaining or excusing anything. Just sit back and listen to people's comments. Now, sometimes, particularly early on in a process, or if your screenplay is particularly confusing, it is okay to ask people if they have any questions or uncertainties that are going to prevent them from giving meaningful feedback, and address those right away. But for the most part, you just want to sit there silently and let people tell you what they thought. When everyone is done and they've said everything they wanted to say, then you can ask them any remaining questions you have that may not have come up. All right, so that's workshop etiquette when it's your work on the table. Now let's talk about critiquing other people's work, because one good turn deserves another. So you want to make sure that you do balance out the positives and the negatives. And by that I just mean that there's going to be something you like and there's going to be something you don't like many, many times throughout a screenplay. So it is just sort of a courtesy to begin giving feedback with, I really love the way you do X, but I felt like Y wasn't quite working for me. Now, whenever possible, it's good to provide concrete examples, because it's a little bit frustrating to get the feedback, you know, the dialogue just didn't work for me. What do you do with that? What about the dialogue didn't work? Was it in a particular scene? Was it a particular character? Was there something specific that didn't work about it? Did you not use contractions? So if people are being vague, you can ask clarifying questions about that. But when you give feedback, try and say, you know, the dialogue didn't work for me in this scene because I felt like it was off topic. That is an actionable note. That person who receives that note can take that and actually do something with it. And as I said, the general template is good to say, like, this scene, dialogue, etc. doesn't work for me because. And the other thing that you want to be aware of is that you do want to respect the big picture idea that they have. They may write in a completely different style than you do. They may take an idea that if somebody had given you the pitch or the log line and said, go write this, they may take it in a completely different direction. And that's fine. It's their work, it's their idea, and you can't bring it back to something that you would do. This is something that I struggle with occasionally, because particularly in the early phases of development, an idea or something like that, I will be very tempted to jump in and want to explain how I would do it and how I think they should do it. But it's not my idea, it's not my story. So you need to respect if you start getting any sort of like pushback from them about defending the way that they are planning to do it. So just be respectful is the point there. All right, that sort of brings us into another bit of contentious area, which is prescriptive feedback. Now, what is prescriptive feedback? This is giving someone a suggestion about how to fix a problem. Now, some people love this type of feedback and others hate it because they want the idea to remain their own. Personally, I really like prescriptive feedback. If something isn't working, I would love to hear how you think it could work better. But some people don't like that. And so it is very good to be upfront about your wishes. So usually when I'm workshopping something, before I even begin having people read, I say, you know, I really like prescriptive feedback. If you have ideas, I want to hear them. But I've also been in workshops where somebody said, I don't want prescriptive feedback, just give me your note and I'll figure out how to fix it later. So you just want to be very clear and upfront and respectful of what people want in terms of their feedback and what they want out of the workshop. So an example of prescriptive feedback, in case you're wondering, would be something like, you know, this character seems kind of boring. You know, what if she had a more interesting job? Like, what if she were a rocket scientist? The rocket scientist part of that is the prescriptive feedback. Somebody who didn't want prescriptive feedback, you should just say, the character seemed boring. That's it. And then they will take that feedback and do something with it. Another example might be, Act 2 seems like it's dragging. What if you added a romantic subplot? That sort of like spitballing of ideas usually falls into the prescriptive category, and would be something you wanted to steer away from if you were working with somebody who didn't like that type of feedback. overall, just again, respect what people want out of the workshop environment. Now, the last question to address is where to find writing workshops. And a good place to start is to see if your local library has one, or if you live somewhere near a college or a community college, they may have one. Community centers also frequently have writing workshops. Sometimes there are small fees that you can pay to cover, coffee or tea as you get together and meet weekly or monthly. But sometimes they're just groups of people who get together and work on their screenplays or other fiction together. So my advice is to just do a Google search of your area to see what turns up. You may find fiction writing groups that won't accept screenwriting, but you may find some that are very welcoming of screenwriting. You may find some that are specific to screenwriting. But the last thing that I will say is that you can get a lot of bang for your buck just by getting your friends together. Now, it's a plus if they're familiar with writing or screenwriting in particular, but you get a lot out of just hearing it out loud, as I described. So you can really get a great experience just by ordering a pizza and asking your friends to come over and do a reading of your screenplay out loud. And even if their feedback is not technically, they can't give you notes on the technical aspects of your script, by the time they've gotten to the end of it, they'll have a pretty good sense of your movie. And so they are, at that point, more like audience members, but audience member feedback is really important too. So I do encourage you to go out of your way to try and get your screenplay read out loud, because it is really valuable for you. And if you can find a group of people who can give you technical comments, that's great. But workshops are one of the most important parts of any creative process, so I highly encourage you to explore whatever options you have available to you. That said, I will look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about rewrites. Now, at the beginning of the process, no one wants to think about rewriting. Writing it once was hard enough, right? But rewrites are a really important part of the creative process, and they deserve a lot of time and attention, sometimes more time and attention than even the first draft. So, let's get started. Alright, to begin, let's talk about editing versus rewriting. Now, editing is working with what you've already got, polishing it and making it shine. Rewriting is a creative process that involves making changes, both big and small, to your screenplay, improving it at all levels. So why rewrite? Well, for one thing, you want to make sure that you fulfilled your creative vision. You want to make sure that you did what you set out to do. This is your second chance if you feel like any element of your goal didn't come through in the finished product. You also need to make sure that you solve the problems that are in your screenplay, because believe me, agents, managers, producers, people who read this are going to see if there are problems, so you want to head those off before you send it out into the world. And you also just want to take the chance to kick it up a notch and elevate its quality. So this is a rewrite pyramid as it appeared in one of Screenwriting U's teleconferences. Now, Screenwriting U are free lectures given by Hal Croasman every month or two about specific aspects of screenwriting. Now, their goal is to sort of give you a little teaser and a little taste of what they do, because they sell a pro series class that is many months long and goes into a lot more detail than these free screenwriting seminars. But the free classes are really useful by themselves, and I highly recommend that you check them out. I've gotten a lot of cool tips and tricks from just tuning in. All you do is you sign up, they give you a phone number that you call in, and they're usually between 2 and 3 hours, and they cover a variety of topics. The rewrite one was, I think, one of the most useful ones that I've listened to, so I highly recommend you check that out if you're interested and would like to get a little bit more information about some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. Now, what I'm going to talk about in this lesson, some of it I learned from this screenwriting class, and some of it comes from my own personal experiences with rewriting scripts. But this pyramid is something that I learned from Hal Croasman. And now what he does is he breaks it down into these 6 different levels. And as you can see, he also divides the pyramid in terms of the surface level and then what's beneath the surface. So the story is the most basic level, and it goes up from there until you finally get into the words, which is just actually what you wrote on the page to convey your story. So what I'm going to do in this lesson is that I'm going to break down each of those levels and tell you what's in it, why it's important, and then I'm going to talk about strategies for rewriting that level. All right, level number 1 is story. And this is the concept, big idea, theme, structure. It begins on page 1 and goes through the entire screenplay up until the last page where you have typed the end. And this is the foundation of your screenplay. Now, lucky for you, this should be really solid if you stuck to your outline, because you spent so much time in the outlining phase making sure that this worked. But we'll talk about some tips for rewriting this in a little bit. The next level up is character. And your leads are the most important, so you really want to make sure that they're three-dimensional and that they feel real. You want to make sure that they're flawed, and that at least your protagonist changes by the end of your screenplay. And you also want to make sure that these characters are compelling, unique, and original. The next level is situation. And these are simply the circumstances you put your characters in. And this is where you make sure that you've avoided things like talking head scenes, by making sure that every scene in every setting is interesting, unique, and that your characters are doing action in it. Which leads us to the next level, 4, action. And this is all the stuff that happens in your screenplay. And you want to make sure it's visual and meaningful. Now, action, you can tell that the surface division sort of occurs in the middle of this action level. And the reason for that is that visual action is what you can see. It's the character running across the screen. It's anything that you can describe in terms of, I saw this. However, action is also meaningful, but that meaning usually occurs below the surface. So that could be a question of, why was the character running across the screen? What meaning did that action have? Now, let's take an example. So we have the running character. Well, is this character running to a disaster to help? Or is this character running away from the disaster because they're a coward? That meaning falls under the surface level, and the visual action is on the surface level, and it's the running itself. Above the surface, we also have dialogue. And this is where you want to make sure that the characters are not just telling one another the story. That's the last thing you want. You are telling the story. The characters' actions are telling the story. You don't want them sitting there saying, oh, so-and-so went to do this. This is not the time or place for that. And ways to do that is that you want to make sure that your dialogue has subtext, which gives it more meaning than the obvious. And one of my favorite examples of this comes from a movie called Sideways. And in this, there's a scene in which Paul Giamatti's character is sitting on the porch talking to this woman. And he's talking about Pinot Noir grapes and how it's so fragile and hard to grow. But what he's actually talking about is himself. So that's the kind of subtext you want to make sure exists within your dialogue, where characters should be saying more than the words actually mean. And that brings us to the top of the pyramid, which are words. And these are descriptions and actions. And this is one of the last things you want to tackle, because it's a lot of wordsmithing. And by that I mean it involves editing and polishing. Because it is important to make sure that your screenplay delivers the correct feel of your story. If you're writing a horror story, you don't want the action to be particularly comedic. And if you're writing a comedy, you don't want it to be particularly serious and dramatic sounding. Alright, now that we have an introduction to all of the levels in the rewrite pyramid, let's talk about some tips for rewriting. In general, you want to start at level 1 and work your way up. Now, this just makes sense because you don't want to be spending lots of time at the top of the pyramid only to discover that you have really fundamental problems down in level 1 or 2 that are going to require massive changes, which are basically going to reset the whole thing, and then you're going to have to spend a whole lot more time working on your dialogue and your wordsmithing again. So, you begin by making sure that your structure still works, and this is down on level 1 in that story. And again, as I said, you should be in pretty good shape here if you stuck to your outline, but this is a good chance to take a step back and check and make sure that all of your checkpoints are there, they're interesting, and they work together. And it's a good time to ask yourself, now that you have the whole thing sitting there, if anything could be improved in that. Example, could you put people in a better situation for one of those checkpoints to heighten the tension, drama, or even just increase the pressure on them a little bit? You also want to make sure that you have delivered conflict throughout. You want to make sure that there are no lulls in the overall structure of your screenplay. You want to make sure that each moment is a little bit more conflict-ridden than the last. And you are continuing to drive through Act 2 into Act 3 and that climax. And this is the one that I think is really important, is that you want to make sure that there is an emotional dilemma that is clear in every scene. Every scene should have a reason for existing, and sometimes you need a scene that just reveals a clue or a plot detail. But if you manage to work in something relevant to your character within that scene, you will really elevate the quality of your screenplay. So if you can get a character struggling with something in every single scene, you will end up with a great end product. Now, finally, if you do discover problems, you want to solve them on level 1 or level 2, not on level 5. You can't add a line of dialogue to fix a fundamental story problem. It just won't work. All right, let's talk about rewriting characters. First, you want to make sure that they have compelling core traits and that they are introduced memorably. So that first description, action, and line of dialogue really ought to go together, because that uniqueness could attract an A-list actor, and that will be immensely helpful in getting your screenplay produced. So, on that line of making sure that they're unique, Hal Crossman gives a pro tip to give the lead characters 3 familiar traits and 1 out-of-the-box trait. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with sort of something generic. So let's say that you have a character who is the high school valedictorian. Now think of 3 things that would describe a high school valedictorian. They'd be intelligent, dedicated, and probably a bookworm. So there we go, we've just described a valedictorian, but she's kind of boring, she's kind of cookie cutter, she's just a stereotypical valedictorian. But now, let's give her an unusual character trait. Let's say she's addicted to adrenaline surges and she does extreme sports on the weekends. Suddenly we have a unique 3-dimensional character who makes us stop and go, wait, what? An example of a character who is very unique and garnered a huge following, I would say, is Buffy from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And if you were going to give her traits as a high school student, you would say that she was energetic, kind, and not interested in school. A generic high school student. But add in the dedicated to slaying vampires and demons, and suddenly you have somebody who is very interesting and unique. So that's what I mean by giving 3 familiar traits and 1 out-of-the-box thing. You can also spend time improving character relationships, adding similarities, differences, and competing agendas to really make your character interactions sing, and make sure that those agendas are very clear in every scene and why the characters are clashing over something. That's a good time to do and think about those things. The next tip would be creating challenging situations. You want to make sure that every scene and situation challenges your lead characters, because you never want them to get comfy. You just want to keep increasing the tension, keep increasing the pressure that they are under. And now these challenges could be to their values, their goals, or you could simply just challenge them physically. And you'd be amazed how challenging a character physically can heighten tension. That's probably the go-to one if you feel like you have a scene that's not quite there yet, is to put the characters in a situation that they are outside of their physical comfort zone, whether it's doing yard work, manual labor, climbing a rock wall, something like that, because every scene should make the reader worry about your character. So one example that came to my mind that was a great example of putting characters in a situation that really challenged both of them in what otherwise could have been a talking head scene is from The Princess Bride. And it's the dialogue that happens between Inigo Montoya and the man in black as he's climbing up the wall, and Inigo lowers the rope down. That's a very challenging situation. For the man in black, it's a very physically demanding situation. He is attempting to scale the cliffs of insanity without falling. That's a challenge right there. We are concerned for his safety. It's also challenging Inigo Montoya because it is a situation that challenges both his values and his goals. Vizzini has told him to kill the man in black, and the simplest thing to do would be to let him fall. However, that goes against Inigo Montoya's value system and sort of code of honor, and so it's a very challenging situation, and so we're concerned for him because what choice is he going to make here regarding the man in black? Is he going to lower the rope or not? So that's a great example, although admittedly a little bit dramatic, but you can find some simpler examples that can do similar things for scenes and situations in your own screenplay. All right, let's talk about rewriting action. As I said, there are two types: visual, which is on the surface, and meaningful, which is usually a little bit subtextual. And you want to ask yourself what the meaning of a scene is and figure out how that meaning can be delivered through the action. So you want to make sure that your scene is not filled with pointless visual action. You want to make sure that the visual stuff is cluing you into deeper meaning. Again, running to a disaster or running away from a disaster, and what that says counts as deeper meaning. Okay, rewriting dialogue. Again, we've established dialogue should not tell the story. However, it should show character, entertain, and by entertain I mean evoke some emotion. It's not always laughter. Great dialogue could make you really feel for a character, bring a tear to your eye. Great dialogue also hints at subtext, and it also creates anticipation for what's coming next. And the last thing that is really important for the rewrite is that each character should have a unique voice. And now, one interesting technique that Hal Croasman recommended was tackling one character a day so that you're only thinking through their perspective, and that really helps me. If I get into one character's head and I think about how they would speak, and I go through every scene that they're in, and I look at each line of dialogue and I think, is this how this person would say it? I've had a lot more success than if I look at a scene as a whole and try and do 2 or 3 people at a time, because they start to sound more similar, and frankly they usually start to sound more like me. I find it's easier to sort of almost take on the character's perspective and go through one at a time and do that. So I think that is a really good tip if you're struggling with that unique voice for each of your characters. And finally we come to wordsmithing. And you do want to come off as a professional, so you want to fix grammar, formatting, spelling, etc. to make sure that it's as good as it could be. And here you want to make sure that your script is a fast read. You want to get more meaning out of fewer words. And in terms of where you can spend your most effective time, spending it on the top 5 emotional moments is a great place to start, because those are what are really going to be memorable about your screenplay and your story. You also need to spend time on the opening dialogue lines of your lead characters, because again, you're trying to attract those A-list actors. And you're also trying to establish the characters so that we're not confused later on and we have a really clear picture of who they are. And you also can spend time on the first 5 pages, because if people can't get past your first 5 pages, they're never going to read the rest of your screenplay. However, do not, under any circumstances, start rewriting, particularly those first 5 pages, until the first draft is done. To do a rewrite, you have to have the whole thing done. You can edit before you're done, but I don't recommend that at all. You need to maintain your forward momentum to get from page 1 to page 120. And after it's all sitting there, that's when you can spend the time to really make sure it's working as a whole. What you don't want to have happen is you don't want to write up to the midpoint, go back to the beginning and rewrite, get up to the midpoint, go back to the beginning and rewrite again. You'll never get to the end. You have to just sort of sit down and admit that you're just going to go from 1 to 120 and there's going to be problems, and that you will fix them later. And when you fix them, remember, you're starting from the bottom and working your way up. Now, frankly, you may need to put the manuscript aside for a few weeks or even a few months before you have the perspective enough and are detached enough to do a good rewrite. This is a real problem for me. When I sit down to write a screenplay, I get really attached to it, and when it's completed, I am an overprotective mother. I cannot see any faults in it. It is perfect exactly as is. So I have to put the screenplay aside, usually for at least a month, maybe 2, and then take it back out and read it again once I've started to forget a little bit of what I was thinking when I wrote it, why I thought it was such a good idea to do it this way. Then, with that distance and that perspective, I can say, you know what? You're right, that scene really doesn't work. What can we do to fix it? Back on level 1, level 2. Finally, I will leave you with this. Rewrites are totally worth the time and effort. Rewriting is the only way to really kick your work up a notch. And it's what's going to help you get your screenplay out there, get it into contests, attract managers and agents, which we'll talk about later. So once you have the completed draft, definitely spend the time to rewrite it and make it your best possible work. So, with that said, I will look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. Now, in this lesson, we are going to revisit the logline and pitch. Now, you may think that it's a little counterintuitive because you already spent so much time working on that logline and that pitch before you even began writing. But it's really worth it to take a step back now that you've finished the screenplay and you have a complete draft, to make sure that it is as good as it can be, and that it is the best reflection and the best tool that you can use to now get this screenplay out there. So let's quickly review. What's in a logline and pitch? Well, it's going to be a description of your protagonist, the conflict in your story, and what your protagonist must do. What doesn't belong in a logline is your protagonist's name or any explicit plot details. Now that you have the draft completed, it's going to be tempting to put those plot details that you so carefully removed back in, so you do have to watch that. Alright, and a quick review. The pitch is a slightly longer description of your idea, about a paragraph, and it includes the protagonist, antagonist, main conflict, and the protagonist's arc. No names and not too many plot details. But this is where you really want to make your reader say, wow, I want to see that movie. The same applies for your logline. Somebody should hear your logline and go, yes, I would pay $10 at the movie theater to see that movie. So, as you begin revisiting the logline and pitch, there are things to ask yourself. Do they still describe the film you wrote? Sometimes they don't. Sometimes you discovered things in your outline phase, or even the writing itself, that upped the game for your screenplay and took it in a different direction. So maybe that logline and pitch are no longer accurate. Maybe the character's arc changed. So if no, write some that do. If you stayed pretty true to what you originally had down, and the logline and pitch still apply, ask yourself, can they be deepened and sharpened? Now that you have a fuller sense of what it was that you created, is there anything you can add or change to make them really pop? And now is the time to ask yourself if your logline and pitch will sell your idea. If no, write some that will. If yes, can you make them even more appealing and user-friendly to make it easy for somebody to get that and say, I absolutely want to read that screenplay. That's the next big hit. Why the logline and pitch matter so much is because this is how you will actually get your screenplay into the hands of an agent, a producer, or a screenplay contest. And these are the primary materials that you'll use to pitch your idea. So you definitely want to spend the time to make them the best that they can possibly be. So here are some tips and tricks for doing that. The first is to write many versions of your logline and pitch and send them to your friends and family for feedback. Ask them, would they see this movie? Would their friends go see this movie? What genre do they think it is? And what kind of budget do they think it would take to make a movie like that? Budget is a little bit of a weird one there, and sometimes it's more helpful than others. But occasionally I've found that, particularly in some genres like science fiction, fantasy, the idea may sound like it's going to cost billions of dollars, when in fact, the way that you've imagined it and the way that you've written your screenplay, it's much simpler than that. And so you do want to make sure that that is accurately conveyed in your logline or pitch if you are to the point where you are hoping to attract an agent or a producer. You want to make sure that it's a sort of accurate reflection of what they're looking for. Conversely, if you have an idea that sort of sounds like it's a simple high school dramedy, and it turns out that there's actually something incredibly complicated and that is going to take major budget, you want to make sure that that's in there as well. The more important things to focus on, though, are whether or not this is something that people would go and see. Because if you're getting, no, this sounds boring, it doesn't mean your movie's boring. Your screenplay is probably fantastic. It just means that the pitch and the logline need to more accurately reflect what it is that people would be getting when they went to see it. Alright, so your test drive for the week is to do just that. Write some loglines and pitches, send them out to your friends for feedback, and see what they have to say. If they give you feedback that they say, no, I wouldn't see that, it's no big deal. It probably doesn't mean that your screenplay isn't worthwhile. It just means that the pitch and the logline need some refinement to make it as good as they can possibly be. So, send it out to them, get their feedback, make revisions as necessary, and repeat. And before you know it, you will have a logline and pitch that are honed and ready to get your screenplay out there into the real world, whether that's winning a contest, into the hands of an agent or manager, or some other opportunity that you find for yourself. So, I will leave you with that and look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about film analysis, because the best way to become a better screenwriter is to watch a lot of movies. But you have to watch them critically. So it requires a little bit more effort than just sitting there and passively enjoying a film. You have to think about the checkpoints. You have to think about what makes it unique, what makes it different. And sometimes, if it's a movie that you don't particularly care for, think about why. Think about what could have been done, or what you would have done differently if you'd been writing that script. So, the way that this is going to work is that I will pick a film in a particular genre, and I will talk about it for a little bit. And I may mention checkpoints, I may mention something unique about the film, something I really like, something I really dislike. And I'll try and keep a pretty even balance of different genres. And I may add more as things come up if I see or rewatch a great movie that makes me think of something that is worthwhile to share. I'll upload some more videos periodically. So, I do recommend that if you're going to watch the analyses, you do watch the film before watching the analysis, because I will spoil the ending and you'll get a lot more out of it if you've already seen the film and know what I'm talking about. Other than that, I do encourage you to watch these films maybe with a friend who's interested in discussing them with you, because it's great to bounce ideas off of one another. And the last thing I'll say is that you may disagree with me. I may love a movie that you hate, and I may hate a movie that you love. And that is absolutely fine, because the world is made up of many different types of moviegoers. But sometimes it's interesting to hear the perspective of somebody who doesn't agree with you. You may also disagree if I've labeled a checkpoint a specific way, and that's okay too, because there's almost always more than one way to analyze a movie, depending on what aspect you're focusing in on and what you got out of the film in sort of the reverse direction. So watch these with an open mind, and I hope that you enjoy them and find them thought-provoking. So I will look forward to seeing you in our further discussions. Hello. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about a drama that is very well known and critically well received, and that's The Shawshank Redemption. So this was written and directed by Frank Darabont, and it's starring Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman. Now, there's some really interesting stuff going on in this film, because if I were to ask you very quickly, who is this film about, you would probably say Andy, Tim Robbins' character. But in fact, the movie is actually about Morgan Freeman's character, Red. But the interesting thing is that the reason that you're inclined to say Andy is that the plot revolves around his actions. Red doesn't take too many actions in this film. He's really the storyteller. And yet, when you take a step back and look at it as a whole, In fact, it's about him and how he changes. And it's interesting because actually, by the time you get to the end of this movie, you realize that Andy has been a bit of a mirror for Red throughout, and is sort of all of the things that Red isn't and eventually becomes at the end. So let's talk about sort of the ending and why this is very interesting. So Red's epiphany happens after he gets out of prison, and there is a very interesting paralleling of shot progressions, so that one of their acquaintances from prison has gotten out several years earlier, and we've seen a bit of a montage sequence of him getting sort of a room in this halfway house hotel thing, getting a job at this grocery store, and eventually not being able to adjust to life on the outside of the prison, and he commits suicide by hanging himself in his hotel room. Now, flash forward a little bit, Red gets out of prison after finally accepting that he will never ever get out, and exactly the same things start to happen. We see him go to the same room in the same halfway house. We see him get the same job at the same grocery store. And we see him look at the same beam that the guy hung himself from earlier in the movie. And we see him considering that beam. And that's his epiphany. Because at that moment, he begins going out and pursuing the clues that Andy left him that ultimately lead him to the letter that tells him where Andy is and how to come find him. And so the epiphany that he has there, I think, is that a future exists and that it is worth pursuing, which we actually find out or realize at the end that Andy has believed all along. We may not have been able to see it at all stages because the screenwriter was pretty clever and hid it from us until the end is revealed that he's been digging this tunnel out through his wall all of these years, but he always had his eye on the future, and Red never did. And there's that interesting sort of flip that happens where Red realizes that, overcomes his sort of stuck in the past nature, and begins to pursue a future outside, like Andy did. So this has got some interesting examples of mirroring in terms of setting scenes and repeating sequences that make us very concerned about Red for a while because we're very attached to him. And so when we see him looking at that beam, we definitely don't want the same thing to happen to him. So that's an interesting technique that you can use to repeat motifs or sequences to create suspense or foreshadowing. This movie is also a great example of setting something up very early with that little itty-bitty rock hammer that Andy gets in prison, and Red has a line about it would take somebody 30 years to dig their way out, and he's about right. It takes about 30 years to get out, but we don't actually take him seriously at the time. So it's an example of foreshadowing being hidden through a comedic line. So there's a lot of really excellent things to look at in the screenwriting behind this movie as well as in its execution. So any kind of drama, any kind of mystery, and if you have a character who's telling a story about someone else, seriously consider whether the movie is actually about the person whose story is being told or about the person who is telling the story and how that makes it different. So I will see you in our next lesson. Hello. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about a thriller, which is not usually a genre that I particularly care for, but this is a thriller that I absolutely loved, even though I wasn't expecting to. And it's The Silence of the Lambs, which was starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. Screenplay by Ted Talley and directed by Jonathan Demme. So there are some really interesting things going on in this film in terms of screenwriting. But it's also an interesting example because it's an example of a film where, while the screenwriting was very intelligent, actually because they managed to cast two actors like Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins who had such interesting chemistry and brought such interesting performances to it, there were actually a few things that happened in the production of the film that couldn't have been anticipated by the screenwriter. So it's interesting to look at those as well. But let's start with something interesting in the screenwriting itself. And once you notice this about the film, you can't unnotice it. But in every single scene, literally every single scene, Clarice Starling is being looked at by men. And this creates a very interesting environment. And it reveals a lot about the world that she's living in and how she's dealing with it, and also says some interesting things about her as a character as well that you can start to sort of parse out. And I'm sure that some of these got added on set by the director, but I'm also equally sure that many of them were written into the screenplay. But it'll even just be a simple line that she's waiting to be checked into a facility, and a male police officer will walk behind her, staring at her. And it creates this very interesting environment in which she, as the almost sole female character, is being watched the entire time, and is being really treated poorly by most of the men around her. And it highlights an interesting thing about the relationship that she has with Hannibal Lecter, because he is the only one who treats her like a gentleman every single time they're in the same space together. And so by not only having it be the characters that she's interacting with, by also having it be characters who are in the background, you really start to see why she's so drawn to this person, even the most unlikely of relationships to develop there. All right, now let's talk about some things that happened during the production of this film that could not have been anticipated by the screenwriter. The one is the sort of iconic line about, I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti, followed by the very definitive sound that Anthony Hopkins makes. That was not written into the screenplay. That was something that was improvised by Anthony Hopkins on set that really freaked Jodie Foster out, which is why the reaction shot in that is so honest, because she's actually really creeped out. So that's an example of an actor bringing something extra to a role that couldn't necessarily have been anticipated by a screenwriter. Now, could you try and write a moment like that into your screenplay? Certainly, but they're going to come up when a film gets produced. Here's another really interesting thing. I think that my favorite scene in this film is the scene that the title actually comes from, The Silence of the Lambs, where he is being held in the large cage structure, and she has gone to visit him, and it is her turn to reveal information about herself to him, and she's telling him the story about the lambs being slaughtered in the spring, and it's a story where she goes and she gets a lamb and she tries to run away with it, and she's unable to save it, and all she can hear is the screaming of these lambs. Now, there is a draft of this screenplay floating around the internet that is one of the earlier drafts of the screenplay, and in it, that scene is written with flashbacks that she's narrating, that show her running out, getting the lamb, running away with it, describing the barn and all of the roads around it, and getting picked up by the sheriff later on. And that is how you would be very inclined to write a scene like this, because you would not assume that two actors could carry a 5-minute long scene with no cut away. But because of the casting and the way that they connected, that scene actually was filmed without flashbacks. It's just the two of them, pretty much in close-up to extreme close-up shots, exchanging that story as he's listening and she's telling it, going back and forth like that. And so as a screenwriter, you would tend to avoid that, because I would look at that and I would say, oh, it's a talking head scene, you want to be really careful, maybe you should consider putting some flashbacks in there. But when you get actors who can really carry it, it can be done to great effect. So that's what I think is really interesting about The Silence of the Lambs, and why it is such an interesting film to watch and analyze for its screenwriting and its structure. So I will see you next time. Hello. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about a classic kids movie. It's a Disney film, and it's The Lion King, which I guarantee most people have seen. Now, this film is interesting for a number of reasons. One is its origin and inspiration, and actually this film is loosely based on Hamlet. Now, those of you who are familiar with Hamlet know just how loosely means in this case. But it is interesting for adult viewers who are familiar with that play to be able to watch this and sort of draw comparisons between characters. Clearly Simba is Hamlet, but then there are some others where arguably Timon and Pumbaa could be said to equate to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Zazu could be Polonius, and the antagonist Scar in this movie is Claudius in Hamlet. Now, this is pretty much Hamlet with a happy ending, so the parallels end there. But it is interesting for adults to be able to sort of watch this with a more sophisticated lens. And it's a good example of doing that in a kid's film, adding things that adult viewers will find funny or amusing or engaging about it, because while your target audience is children, the people who are paying for the movie and who are going to go take their kids to see it are adults who need to be able to sit through it without losing their minds. So this is a good example of a technique used to do that. The thing that's interesting about this film to me is that it has a theme and a character flaw that are very classic for children's movies. And it's taking responsibility is the epiphany that Simba has to have, and putting the past behind is sort of a sub-theme there. To do that, you have to be able to overcome what happened and move forward and take responsibility for your home and be the person who you are supposed to be. So the moment that happens in this film is when Rafiki comes to find Simba after he's grown up away from home. And he's delivering a life lesson, and he does it in an interesting way because he hits Simba on the head with his stick. And Simba asks him why he did that, and Rafiki enigmatically replies, "It doesn't matter, it's in the past." But experiencing this lesson, it makes Simba realize that he has to put the past behind him and move forward and take responsibility for his home and his pride and go confront Scar and overcome him. Another interesting thing about screenwriting in this particular example is that it's a musical, which means that the actual text of the screenplay is significantly shorter than it would have been if there were no songs in there, because the music and the lyrics drive so much of it. And yet the screenwriter also has a bit of a sort of reciprocal relationship with those, because even though the songs and the music are in there, they still, in a sense, need choreography. And since this is an animated film, that probably fell to the screenwriter in this case. So that's what's interesting when you take a look at children's animated films and sort of compare them to feature-length films that are made for adults with live action. So I will see you in our next lesson. Hello. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about a romantic comedy that is very classic and I like a lot. And it's You've Got Mail. Now, this came out in 1998, starring Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. It was written by Nora and Delia Ephron and directed by Nora Ephron. So I chose this movie because it's a pretty classic romantic comedy and really represents the genre. Now, I also think that it represents one thing that's sort of interesting and unexpected that I've noticed about the majority of romantic comedies. Now, when you stop and think about a romantic comedy, colloquially that gets called a chick flick, which means it's aimed at women. And so you would sort of assume that a movie aimed at women that was about a guy and a girl would be about the girl. But actually, what I've observed is that 9 times out of 10 in a romantic comedy, it's actually about the guy. So when you start trying to structure the film and choosing those checkpoints and identifying them, a lot of the time if you're approaching it from the women's point of view, you'll find that some are missing or unclear. But if you actually flip it around and treat the male character as the protagonist, you have a lot more success finding those checkpoints. And this movie is no exception. This movie is really about Tom Hanks' character, Joe Fox, and how he changes. On to that. This is a very well-structured film, and it's very easy to identify all 9 checkpoints. But the one that I think is the most interesting to point out is Joe Fox's epiphany, which is actually pretty subtle and represents an interesting moment for the screenwriter, because it was very important to get this moment in there. But Joe Fox is not actually acting during the moment that shows his epiphany. He's reacting. So what happens is he's sitting in an elevator with his fiancée and a couple of other people and the doorman, who have all gotten stuck in this elevator. And they're sitting there, and it's clearly been quite a while. And they're going around the elevator, and they are talking about what they will do or want to do if and when they ever get out of the elevator. His fiancée says something that is fairly vapid and not terribly insightful. And he doesn't really know what to say at all because he doesn't know what he wants. But then the guy sitting next to him starts talking about a relationship that was very meaningful to him that he wishes he could fix and have a second chance at if he ever gets out of the elevator. Now, the epiphany occurs in a shot that's only about 5 seconds long, and it's Tom Hanks's face while he's listening to this story, and that's the moment where he changes, and he realizes that he's been approaching life from completely the wrong angle, and that it's time to make a change and to start pursuing the person that he actually loves, which is the Kathleen Kelly, the other character, Meg Ryan's character in this film. Now, from a screenwriter's point of view, that moment was very important, and so you had to really slow down, and I imagine that that moment was actually written out, and there was probably a fairly long description of what Tom Hanks's face looked like in that scene, or that the character's face would look like as he was hearing this, to really highlight that that was an important moment to capture, to make sure that that moment made it into the final cut of the screenplay. So that's what I have to say about the most interesting things for You've Got Mail. I highly recommend this as a pretty classic romantic comedy to look at structurally. So if you're working on something like that, check this movie out if you haven't already seen it, and I will see you next time. Hello. In this lesson, we're going to talk about a superhero movie, a genre that has absolutely been exploding at the box office recently. But this is actually one of the very first superhero movies that was made in the sort of recent spate of them, and it's Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire's version, and this was based on the comic book by Stan Lee. The screenplay was by David Koepp, and it was directed by Sam Raimi. The reason that this is my favorite superhero movie is that this movie is very character-centric. So even though there's tons of action and adventure, it truly focuses on Peter Parker's character, his flaw, and he's a very interesting person and character, and it doesn't get buried in a whole bunch of special effects or action sequences, particularly in this first movie. So the thing that is interesting to note about this is how strong Peter Parker's flaw is, and how that gets played out. And it's also an interesting case because structurally, there is one flaw that this movie revolves around, but Peter Parker always has a flaw that he never quite overcomes. So the sort of origin story of Spider-Man is that he gets bit by the special genetically engineered spider and develops these superpowers. And so instead of using them for good, he's out trying to make money to buy a car to impress Mary Jane. And his uncle is attacked one night, and he is unable to stop it. And he blames himself for that. So Peter Parker's flaw that he never overcomes is an inability to put that past behind him. But the flaw that this movie structurally revolves around is his inability to take responsibility for his newfound power. And so the way that I see this playing out is that his actions, up until a certain point, the point where he has his epiphany in this movie, are driven sort of in an effort to bury the past, reduce his guilt. He's going out there and he's doing good things, but he's not quite taking responsibility. The tagline for the movie is, with great power comes great responsibility. So the moment that precipitates that is that the Goblin attacks his aunt, and when his family is under attack again, he realizes that he needs to take responsibility and go after the Goblin, and that he can no longer run from this event that happened in his past, that he's going to have to directly confront it. In terms of the screenwriting, in addition to that being a very strong checkpoint structure for Peter Parker's character, there's also some interesting things that we've talked about in previous lessons that go into great screenwriting, and one of them is creating really iconic images. And one of them is so iconic it actually ended up on the back of the box, and it's the upside-down kiss. And that is a moment that is not terribly tied into the film structurally, but does create those really interesting moments where it's like, you know, quick, think of Spider-Man, what do you think of? And that's one of those images that flashes to your mind, that it's going to keep you in people's culture and cultural awareness. And in fact, that's demonstrated by the fact that this movie has in fact been remade since then, The Amazing Spider-Man. And it's clearly a story that is very culturally popular and under discussion right now, which is one of the interesting things about this film. So that's what I have to say about Spider-Man and why it's one of the best superhero movies out there. So I will see you in our next lesson. Hello. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about a film that I had a great difficulty categorizing in terms of a genre. It's sort of an action, comedy, sci-fi amalgam, and it's The Fifth Element. So this was directed by Luc Besson, and the screenplay was by Luc Besson and Robert Mark Kamen, and it's starring Bruce Willis and Mila Jovovich. And the interesting thing about this movie, other than its incredible genre-bending nature, is the characterizations. Every character in this movie is very unique from every other character. The dialogue, you would never confuse a line of dialogue written for any of these individuals for any of the other characters. And also, there are a couple of really key scenes that tie together and mirror one another that drive home one of the themes of this movie. So in addition to some pretty great writing in terms of funny one-liners and things like that, there are some great quotes from this movie that you can pull out and remember. One of my favorites is, "Does anybody else want to negotiate?" So there are some great lines like that. So you always want to make sure that you're incorporating some of those, particularly if you're writing in sort of a comedy or action style into your screenplay. In terms of the characterizations, if you look at any character and you just stare at their dialogue, they all have unique speech patterns. They all have unique deliveries, which is arguably a directorial and actor note, but can also, I think, be influenced to a great deal by the writer in terms of punctuation and even how much text you give someone. You can really get a sense of somebody who is a very fast talker, like Ruby Rhod, versus somebody who stutters a lot, like the novice who is working for Cornelius. And then, of course, you have somebody who doesn't have full command of English for much of the movie, which is an interesting challenge in and of itself to figure out how to make her communicate and interface with everybody else. Oh, another thing that I really liked about this movie and thought that was great from a screenwriting perspective is the pacing, which is very well done in this. A pitfall of action movies is to have non-stop action and no chances to stop and take a break and think about what's happened. But this movie very carefully follows almost every really intense action scene with quieter moments that really let you think about what you just saw and absorb how visually stunning and unique the world is and how exciting the chase scene was that you just saw, but also give a chance to drive home character, which is why when you are finished with this movie, you would like to see it again and again because you remember the characters so fondly. So right near the beginning, there's a very intense chase scene as the Fifth Element has escaped from the containment facility that she is in, and she, is going through ductwork, and she ends up outside this building, and she jumps off, and she's going through all these cars, and she, crashes through Corbin Dallas's, Bruce Willis's taxi cab roof, and there's sort of this quiet moment. There's a little bit of a lull in that where she's asking for help, and then it takes off again, and there's a very intense car chase in this aerial taxi cab that he's driving, and at the end of that there's again another very quiet moment where they are sort of waiting things out, and he realizes that she's passed out in the back and he has to go find Cornelius, and the plot really kicks off. But that sort of like ebb and flow of really intense action followed by quiet reflection and quiet character moments is something that you definitely want to strive for and make sure that you're not bombarding your audience or your reader with too much action and no chance to think about it or learn anything about the characters, because the other thing that those quiet moments give is a chance to see how the characters react to what's just happened, and that often says a lot more about them as people than what they're actually doing in the action scenes. The movie continues to do that, although at the end, in the climax, as with most action movies, there is more action and more non-stop action. But even then, there are these moments that are either funny or reflective that are sort of these brief lulls in the action. So I do recommend this as a template for an action film. So that's what I have to say about The Fifth Element. I think that this is a great example of a science fiction action comedy adventure. So if you are doing any kind of genre bending, it's great to see how they wove all of that together. And I will see you in our next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. We're now going to talk about getting your screenplay out there, because after all, if it sits in a drawer, that's no good. So, before you begin the process of sending your screenplay out, here's what you have to have. The most important thing is your logline. You also need a completed, polished screenplay, and you need a query letter. Let's talk quickly about query letters, because at this point, you know all about loglines, and you also have a wonderful draft of your screenplay that has perfect structure and has been rewritten elegantly. So query letters. What is a query letter? A query letter is something for a producer, agent, or manager that explains what you have, your logline, why they know why they need it, and maybe a little bit about who you are. But the key thing is keep it short. The most important things are a professional greeting, the logline, and a professional sign-off. It's probably not worth it for you to include a bio unless you've won a prestigious award or screenwriting competition, or there's something special about you that qualifies you to write this story. If you were writing about designing theme parks and you worked as an Imagineer at Disney, that would be something that would be worth noting in a query letter that gives you just a little bit of credence. Alright, so now that you have all of those materials ready, you're thinking, great, now what? Congratulations, you've got a finished screenplay, but what are you going to do with it? Well, here are the things that you can try. You can try to get an agent or manager, which I'll talk about. You can enter screenwriting contests, which I will also mention. And you can pursue personal contacts in the business. So let's start with agents versus managers. Now, what's the difference here? Those terms are a little bit fuzzy for anybody who hasn't grown up with a family member in the business. So they are very different, and they do very different things. So an agent wants to sell something today. Managers want to develop your career over the long haul. So, agents appear when stuff is happening in your career. This means you've just won a major screenplay and suddenly you have agents knocking down your door trying to be the person who says that they can sell your stuff. Managers are going to spend the time planning and strategizing your career, as well as nurturing your writing. The agents aren't really interested in developing you as a writer. They want to sell what you have right now. So in terms of how you get in touch with these people and how long you're in contact with them, with an agent, you're going to be lucky if they return your phone call. A manager is going to spend a lot of time critiquing your work on all levels, from the idea phase to the outline to the actual writing itself. And two other distinctions between agents and managers are that agents can broker deals for you. Managers can't do that, but they can produce your work. So those are important distinctions to keep in mind if that ever becomes an issue. The other thing that gets thrown in here are that if you get to a level where you are making a deal, there's probably also a lawyer who's going to step in and help with that process. But that's a little bit complicated and outside the scope of this particular class. So focus on the difference between the agents and the managers. Now, there is a running gag that getting a manager is like getting married, but that getting an agent is having a one-night stand. And I think you can see why that is. And it's nothing against agents. Their job is to sell things. And so when there's heat around you, when there's stuff happening in your career, you've won prestigious awards, fellowships, screenwriting contests, they think that they can come in and make a deal for you. The manager is more interested in your long-term potential. And so they just serve very different functions. So let's talk a little bit about getting an agent versus getting a manager. Now, getting an agent requires skill, luck, and something to happen in your writing career. Once you start talking with an agent, the thing that you can do to help expedite the process and make sure that that relationship actually becomes successful is to understand how the deals are made. And this you can do by talking to people who've been there. If you have a manager, they'll probably help you through this process. But there are some things that are just not realistic. You're never going to get final approval on your script in the creative process. It's going to be one of the directors, producers, or somebody else like that. So don't make unreasonable demands when you're negotiating your contract. Just go in with your eyes open and know what's possible and what's not. In terms of getting a manager, you want to do your research because you want to find somebody who represents people whose work you like. And you also want to make sure that you like this person and that you feel like you can talk to them, because it's like being in a marriage. You're going to talk to this person a lot throughout your career, and they're going to be very influential in shaping your creative work. So you better make sure that this is somebody that you like. And you also need to make sure that your manager likes your writing style. You could get along with them fabulously, but if they're trying to push you in a direction that you don't like, you're going to have a very unsuccessful working relationship. And then the last, but probably most important thing you want to make sure is that they actually have a plan for getting you out there. After all, their job is strategy. That's the number one reason to have a manager, is that they're going to have a plan and a strategy for how to get you out there. So, as a young or beginning writer, you definitely want a manager. You want somebody who's going to be your cheerleader and your coach, helping you get into a position where you can begin attracting agents. Many managers work for management companies. Some are big, some are smaller. And again, just do your research, find out what environment you're going to be most comfortable with and who represents work that sort of clicks with you and what you are trying to do. As a word of caution, beware if someone is charging a reading fee. They're probably not legitimate and are most likely in it for the commissions. A real management house is not going to charge to read your work. They're banking on the fact that they're going to get 10 or 15% of any deal you make through them as a result of them fostering your writing career, which is really a small price to pay for having that close mentorship with your manager. All right, enough about agents and managers. Let's talk about screenwriting contests. There are literally hundreds, maybe thousands of screenwriting competitions in the US and even more internationally. And there are some really big ones, and there are also some really specific ones. Now, in a perfect world, you would win one of the really big, important ones, because that means that agents and managers will start knocking on your door. However, if you have a screenplay that targets a very specific genre, and there is a festival that handles exactly that, even if it's not quite as big a deal, perhaps, you still get to put in all of your query letters that you won that contest, and that is going to definitely open doors for you. So it is worth pursuing all options. But the bottom line is to do your research before submitting, because you do want to get the most bang for your buck, because it can get expensive entering contests. Something else that's worthwhile to point out about contests is that I think that they are on the rise in terms of how screenwriters are getting discovered. I think that a lot more people have access and are interested in screenwriting these days, and that people are winning screenwriting contests who don't have managers, who don't have agents, and that's how they're getting discovered. So it's worth it to keep your eye on these screenwriting contests, because they can be a very valuable tool in getting your screenplay out there. Okay, let's talk about how to enter a contest. The first thing you want to do is read the submission guidelines very carefully. You probably will need to pay a fee of about $50, although you can give or take about $20 for most screenwriting festivals. You may need to submit a copy of your script without your name, maybe another version with your name, depending on whether they're judging them blind. And they may ask you for a logline, synopsis, or pitch with very specific word limits. Bottom line, follow the instructions. If you are not giving them what they want, you're not going to succeed. So make sure you spend the time. Don't try and get in, with like an hour until the deadline. Plan ahead. There's also usually early bird discounts if you are going to enter the contest several months in advance. So that does increase the time that you have to wait to find out what happens, but it can definitely be a dollar saver there. So let me mention a few big screenwriting contests to consider. The first is the Nicholl Fellowship in Screenwriting, and this is run by the Oscar Committee, and there's prize money for the winners so that they can live on it while doing a writing fellowship for a year. Industry execs read all of the finalists, and most are very interested in the quarter and semifinalists as well. Another big one is the Final Draft Big Break Screenwriting Contest. That gets a lot of talk every year. There's cash prizes, industry exposure for the winners, and they claim that most winners do secure representation. The same goes for the script pipeline contest. There's some cash prizes. You get read by lots of industry execs, so getting into the final rounds of any of those can really help you. If you're a television writer, the Disney ABC Writing Fellowship is actually a really unique one because the winner gets hired to work for ABC. So that's quite a prize right there. So that's something to look into if you're more interested in television than film. Okay. The last thing is to pursue personal contacts. So if you know someone in LA who knows someone who knows someone, go for it. You have nothing to lose. Now, if you're going to do that, remember that people don't like being asked for things, but they do like lending a helping hand. So don't be demanding, be respectful of their time, but if you ask someone if you can buy them coffee and pick their brain about the business, they're probably going to say yes. And frankly, the network of people that you can meet is going to be one of your most important tools for getting your screenplay out there. So definitely do make use of any personal contacts that you have, and do ask, because if you don't ask, you'll never find out what could have happened. So I do really recommend pursuing anything that you have if you have contacts. All right, so that was sort of an overview of how to get your screenplay out there. If you're interested in pursuing an agent or a manager, definitely do your research. You can find tons of information online about different management companies. If you're into screenwriting contests, I'm going to talk about a few different online resources for how to find them in the next lesson. And if you're pursuing personal contacts, be respectful. So I will leave you with all of that information about how to get your screenplay out there, and look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about online resources for screenwriters. And most of these are geared toward helping you get your screenplay out there, which we talked about in the last lesson. But we live in a very digital age, and so there are a ton of resources online that can help you out. So I'm going to talk about a few of them, but there are many more. So let's get started. All right, the first one I'm going to mention is something called withoutabox.com. And this is an online resource that most screenwriting competitions are using to handle their paperless submissions process. So with this, you can search festivals. You can upload your screenplays once, but submit it to multiple festivals at a time. You can also keep track of your submission status and receive a weekly email of spotlit festivals to consider. It only gets a 3 out of 5 for user interface, in my opinion, but it's pretty useful and a lot of people do use it, so I highly recommend checking it out. And I also really like the festival spotlight email I get because I learn about competitions I would never have thought to search for. So, sort of along that line, there's another thing called the Script Pipeline Writers Database. This requires a yearly membership fee, but you can email them query letters, synopses, loglines, story concepts, etc. for review. You can also view listings to see who's looking for what kind of scripts, and you get a discount on Script Pipeline Writers Workshop notes, which are when you send a completed draft of your screenplay, and an industry professional reviews it and gives you notes back. That may be something that you're interested in. It usually is pretty pricey, but you do get the kind of feedback that you would be getting from executives who are looking at your screenplay. So depending on your goals, it may be worthwhile. Now, I entered the very first student screenwriting contest that Script Pipeline did. And so sort of as a thank you and a bonus for all of the students who entered that, they gave everybody a 5-year membership to this database, which I had previously been sort of skeptical of. But since it was free, I thought, what the heck? So I sent them in some questions about a logline and synopsis, actually for the script that I had entered into the contest and didn't win. But I thought, well, maybe it came down to my materials. Maybe my pitch wasn't great. So I sent it in, and I was expecting to get a one-line sort of semi-automatically generated response from somebody, and I actually got a personal letter giving me some really intelligent feedback on my script and or on my log line, but it turned out that the guy who had answered my email had been reading the submissions for the student script, and he wrote back and he told me, you know, I just wanted to let you know that you were really close, and what it came down to was your dialogue, and here's some notes on your dialogue. So I can't promise that you will get that level of attention from everyone, because they just don't have time to read as many screenplays as there are screenwriters out there. But I was deeply impressed by the fact that this guy took the time and effort to write me a fairly lengthy email giving me some advice, which I took and I think really did kick the screenplay up a notch. So the yearly fee is a little bit, you do have to consider that. But I have to say that I have, the times that I have reached out and used their services, been very impressed with the writer's database. So it's something to consider. Now, probably one of the most important ones right now is inktip.com, and this is a great resource. I really like this. Again, it's a little bit pricey, but I think in this case it's definitely worth the money, because it's $70-ish to list a screenplay for 6 months on their site. But industry professionals really do look at the site, and you can get a log of everybody who's seen your log line and synopsis. So the way that it works basically, if you're going to list a screenplay, is that you go and you pay your $70-ish and then you upload a PDF of your screenplay. You also upload a log line and a synopsis, which is about a 1-page description. There may be options for other things if you want to add a treatment or such, but those are really the core ones. And you get a list of everybody who looks at your log line. There's a way for industry professionals to go on there and search through the list, so they can say, I'm looking for a drama. You get to check a bunch of boxes that say, you know, what genre is it? How much do you think it'll cost? Does it have a big cast, a small cast? Does it require a lot of locations? So they can basically go in and do the same thing, where they say what genre they're looking for, approximately what budget, size, etc. And you will pop up in their search results, and you can see who took the time to click on your log line and read it. And what you may find is that your log line isn't working because you get tons of hits on your log line, but no one ever wants to read the synopsis. So again, that's not a reflection on your story idea. It just means your log line needs a little bit of work. But throughout that entire 6-month listing, you can go in and edit things. You can try different versions of your log line to see what attracts attention, to see what makes people click through and read your synopsis. But what's really worth the money is the Inktip Preferred newsletter. And depending on whether you have a script listed or not, or various deals that they run, it can be anywhere from $35 to $60 for 4 months to receive this weekly email. But you get a weekly email with 6 to 10 leads, which are studios that are looking for specific scripts, and they describe what they're looking for, and there's a link for you to submit your materials. Now, I have 3 screenplays at the moment that are finished, and I'm ready to send out. They're in 3 different genres. And so given that, I would say that I see at least 1 lead every 3 or 4 weeks that fits something I've written. And most of the time, they do actually email you back, even if what you sent in isn't what they're looking for, which is just a nice professional courtesy. So I have to say that that Inktip Preferred newsletter is definitely worth the money, even if it's just letting you keep track of what people are looking for and what genres are really hot right now. And sometimes, I even find it's a great source to get ideas, because occasionally somebody will be looking for something that I haven't written, anything remotely like that, but I'll stop and think, wow, that really is a good idea, and file it away for future reference, and maybe write something that sort of is along those lines. So I highly recommend you check out inktip.com. This is the one that I most highly recommend and think is worth, you get the most bang for your buck in terms of this. So my general advice for being a screenwriter online is that there are a ton of resources out there, but you do want to be a little careful with your money because it's easy to get sucked into lots of things. So do your research and read reviews, but read reviews that are not on the website, on the website that you're considering, before committing to something. But that said, there are really great resources out there, and if they fit your needs and what you're looking for, I highly recommend you take advantage of them. So, that said, I will see you in the next lesson. Hello, and welcome back. You made it to the grand finale. Thank you so much for taking the class. We covered so much screenwriting, from the history of television and film to what the screenwriting industry looks like today, to structuring a screenplay, writing a screenplay, polishing it, and getting it out there. I hope you learned a lot and had a good time. I had the honor and pleasure of learning from some of the best screenwriters out there, and I really enjoyed passing on the knowledge to you. May it speed you on your journey to screenwriting success. Now, if you enjoyed the class, please leave me a 5-star review with a brief comment. Future students really value your opinions, so I would appreciate it if you could take the time to leave that comment. Now, we have an online community of novel and screenwriting graduates that I invite you to join. Here you'll be able to share your work and critique other students' projects. You can find the link for this in the supplemental material in the Next Steps lesson before this. If you're interested in taking more classes, you can check out Adapting Novel to Screenplay at writingacademy.com. In this class, I sat down with novelist and writing instructor Steve Alcorn to talk about how we turned his young adult novel, Everything in Its Path, into a feature-length screenplay. This class addresses the specific challenges of adapting novels into screenplays. I also encourage you to check out the next steps in the lesson before this, where you'll find a document with links to all of the resources that I've talked about. If you download it, the links will activate. And again, thank you so much for taking this class. I hope to see you at the box office someday soon. And until then, happy writing.